Introduction. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the gentle sound of waves lapping against worn wooden hulls, the quiet creak of ropes swaying with the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, the slow rhythmic beat of a drum echoing across the harbor. Tonight we are setting sail not into dreams alone, but into the Aegean Sea, to a time when ships were rowed, not with engines or sails, but with the sweat and suffering of hundreds of men packed shoulder to shoulder beneath the deck. This was the world of the ancient Greek trireme, a warship both brilliant and brutal, beautiful and unforgiving. This journey will not rush. It will not start with a battle or a triumphant moment in history. Instead, it will ease you into the slow, repetitive rhythm of life at sea, a rhythm that became the heartbeat of ancient Athens. From the callous palms of a poor farmer-turned-rower to the philosophical banter of an Athenian general reclining with wine in hand, you'll drift through the hidden world of war and peace that floated just above the waterline. Tonight, the sea is calm. The air smells faintly of salt, sun-baked wood, and the smoke of distant fires. Our ship is ready. You are aboard. Let the oars dip into the still water, and let the voyage begin. Chapter 1. Cramped, painful, rhythmic life on a warship. The sun rises slow over the Aegean. Its light spills across calm blue water, touching the tips of distant islands, and warming the sails of hundreds of ships docked in the harbor. But below the decks, where the real work is done, the light barely reaches. Down there, it's always dim, damp, close. You sit on a wooden bench no wider than a loaf of bread. There's a man beside you, and another beside him, and another beyond that. You're all pressed shoulder to shoulder. There's not much room to move. Not much room to breathe either. The air smells like salt, sweat, old wood, and the fish stew someone spilled last night. You get used to it, they told you, but you never really do. Above your head, the oars are set in long rows, slipping out through holes in the hull. The handles are worn smooth from years of hands gripping them. You take hold of yours. It's heavier than it looks. The moment your hands wrap around it, you feel a strange kind of silence settle on your chest. Because this is your place now. This bench, this oar, this rhythm, that's about to start and won't stop for hours. This is your life until the war is over, or until the ship breaks apart beneath you. Then the drum starts. A low, steady thud. Once, then again. The pace is slow at first. A kind of warning. The ship is waking up. You pull the oar back in time with the beat just like the others. The man behind you doesn't speak. Neither do you. Talking while rowing is not allowed. The officer walking between the rows doesn't tolerate noise. His footsteps echo above the drum. He carries his stick in one hand. No one wants to feel it across their back. As the sun rises higher, the rhythm quickens. Your arms start to burn. It's not even mid-morning. By noon, your back aches. Your palms are raw and your thighs have gone numb. Every stroke sends a jolt through your shoulders, down your spine, into your legs. You clench your jaw to push through the pain. Some men try to sing in their heads. Others count strokes until they lose count and start again. You start thinking about what you'll do when you get back to land, but there's no land in sight. It's hot now. The sea breeze doesn't reach down here. Sweat runs down your chest and pools in the small of your back. The man next to you slips a little and his oar bumps yours. The officer is there in seconds. He doesn't say a word. Just smacks the man's shoulder with the stick and moves on. No one dares look up. There's no privacy on a warship. Not for eating, not for sleeping, not for anything else. You relieve yourself in the bucket passed from hand to hand. You sleep where you sit, slumped over the oar or curled up against the hull. Some of the older rowers have learned how to drift off during short breaks without falling off the bench. You're not there yet. Meals come twice a day, if the weather allows. Barley bread, olives, maybe a few dried figs if you're lucky. Water is rationed. It's stored in big clay jars and passed down the rows in thin cups. If you spill yours, you get nothing until the next round. You don't spill. Not twice. Sometimes the ship stops near shore so the men can stretch their legs. Those are good days. You walk in circles on the sand just to feel your body in the open air again. But even then, the officers watch. The ship must leave again soon. Always soon. There's never enough time to forget the smell of the deck or the way the oar fits in your hands. Life on a Greek warship isn't a story of battles and glory. Not really. It's about rhythm. The rhythm of rowing, of meals, of sleep, if you can find it. The rhythm of a drum that tells your muscles when to move. It's about routine and repetition and exhaustion that never quite leaves you. And still, men sign up. Some are forced. Others volunteer. Maybe they believe the city will reward them. Maybe they want to prove something. Maybe they just don't have a better option. For whatever reason, they come, they take their seat on the bench. They grip the oar, and they row. You can hear it now, can't you? That steady beat of the drum. Slow, then faster. It builds like a second heartbeat. A life not your own. A rhythm you didn't choose. But one you must follow, because on this ship, you're not a citizen. You're not a fighter, you're an oarsman. And as long as the drum keeps beating, you'll keep rowing. The sound of the drum isn't just for rhythm. It's for control. The man beating it isn't a musician. He's a timekeeper. Every beat tells you who's in charge. The officers want discipline, and the drum gives it. If your oar hits out of time, it throws off the row behind you. Then the whole deck stutters. The officer notices. There's no grace for mistakes. Not here. Your body begins to remember the beat before your mind does. It happens over days, then weeks. Your arms pull before you tell them to. Your legs brace without thinking. Even your breath begins to match the movement in and out with every heavy stroke. Some say that's what breaks you. That moment when your body stops asking for permission and simply obeys. Others say that's when you become part of the ship, just another moving part. Below deck, time moves differently. There are no clocks, no sun to measure by. Just shifts, orders, and meals. You mark the passing days by the soreness in your muscles, by the slow scabs forming across your palms, by the faces around you growing more hollow. A cough from one rower spreads fast. There's no escaping it. The air doesn't move enough to carry sickness away. You wipe sweat from your face with your sleeve and keep rowing. You hear the man behind you groan under his breath. He's older. Maybe in his 40s. You don't know his name. You've never asked. Friendships on a warship can be dangerous. Men die, or they're punished, or they disappear when the ship makes port. It's better not to get attached. Still, you share rations when someone's cup is empty. You tighten the strap on the sandal of the man beside you when he can't reach it. These quiet acts of kindness are the only luxury you can afford. Every few days, the captain lets the crew stretch their legs on shore. But it isn't rest. The men repair the hull, retie ropes, scrape barnacles from the sides. You refill barrels with rainwater, or if you're lucky, from a fresh stream. No one talks much. Their bodies are too tired. Their minds too dulled. There's not much to say that hasn't already been said with a glance or... At night, sleep comes like a thief. It sneaks in when your guard is down. You might fall asleep, still holding the oar. Or with your head leaned against the man beside you, neither of you noticing until the drum calls again. There are dreams, sometimes, of walking through fields, of sitting at a table, of wind across your face. But more often, there's nothing. Just blackness. A pause between rhythms. The ship itself groans and shifts. It's not built for comfort. Every plank swells and contracts with the water. You know the creaks by sound now? That's the front sail line. That one is the rudder post. That soft knocking under your feet. Probably a rat. You stopped flinching at the sound weeks ago. Some of the men speak of home in whispers when the officers are above deck and the stars are out. One talks of a wife he left behind. Another of a small vineyard he hopes to return to. Most don't speak at all. Maybe they don't have anything to go back to. Maybe they know they won't live long enough to try. You hear stories too, about rowers who jump ship in the night, swimming toward a distant shore. Most are never seen again. Maybe they drown. Maybe they're caught. Maybe they make it and decide never to speak the name of Athens again. You think about it sometimes when the ache in your shoulders is too much and the air feels like it's pressing against your chest. But the thought fades. The drum calls again, and you row. One morning, a new man is brought aboard. He's thin, barely more than a boy. His eyes are wide. He smells like the city. He asks too many questions. He'll learn quickly, or he won't. Either way, he'll take his seat and row, just like the rest. There's no ceremony here. No formal introductions or goodbyes. When someone dies, he's taken above deck and dropped over the side. If there's time, a prayer is said. If not, the ship keeps moving. The open sea doesn't wait. Not for the living and not for the dead. Sometimes, in the rare quiet moments, you think about how strange it is. That a city built on democracy and reason sends men like you into a floating prison. That while philosophers speak in marble courtyards, your world is made of salt-stained wood and bruised hands. The contrast is sharp, and yet both are part of Athens. Both are necessary. You wonder if the men who build these ships have ever sat in the belly of one. If they know what it feels like to row until your hands bleed. If they understand what it means to be part of something and yet invisible. Your sweat fuels their empire, but your name will never be written in stone. A gull calls overhead. You can just barely hear it. It reminds you that there's a world beyond the hull. A sky. A breeze. A shoreline somewhere. But those things feel far away. Too far to touch. You turn your focus back to the oar. Grip. Pull. Breathe. Repeat. The officer calls for silence. As if you've been speaking. As if you ever do. The drum changes rhythm, signaling a change in direction. You adjust your stroke. The ship turns. The day continues. And you row. Chapter 2. Rowing below deck until your hands bleed before the war. He worked a small patch of land just outside Athens. The soil wasn't rich, but it gave enough to survive. Barley, onions, a few rows of beans when the rain was kind. He lived in a home with 3 walls made of stone and a 4th of woven reeds, patched by hand every season. He never had enough to hire help, but he had strong arms and a quiet stubbornness that kept him going. His name wasn't known beyond his village, and that never bothered him. A whistle, a drumbeat, a command to stand and stretch, though there was little space to do either. He threw his oar down, shouted about his rights as a citizen, about the injustice of it all. He no longer noticed the sweat in his eyes, the salt on his lips, or the sting in his knees from the wooden bench. They shared water, shifted weight to ease each other's pain, nudged shoulders when one began to fall behind. No words were needed. In the rhythm of the oars, in the shared motion of survival, they found a strange kind of bond. The farmer nodded. That was all. No backstory. No exchange of names. And every so often, a song would drift from above deck, a sailor humming to himself as he tied a line or scrubbed a plank. The sound was soft, almost lost in the creak of the ship and the slosh of water, but it carried something rare. Something almost like hope. Just a simple recognition. The next morning, they sat side by side on the bench. And so he gripped the oar, pulled with steady arms, and followed the rhythm. Their oars moved in time. Each stroke matched to the beat. The old soldier adjusted his grip slightly, and the farmer mimicked it. His hands stopped bleeding after that. It wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. But it was real. What you did notice were the eyes around him. The quiet strength of the man 2 benches up, who always rode first and ate last. The nervous twitch of the boy behind him, barely grown, trying to hide his fear. The slow, calm presence of the old soldier beside him, who never flinched, no matter how hard the day. The officers dragged him off the bench. There was no trial, no chance to explain. He was tied to a post on the dock and beaten until he stopped shouting. When he was returned, he didn't row again. He sat on the bench like a ghost, hands in his lap, staring ahead. No one asked what happened next. They didn't have to. Food came in metal bowls, passed down a line of rough hands. It was always the same bread, olive paste, sometimes a dried fig or two. Water was shared from a cracked jug, sipped quickly and without waste. Hygiene was a memory. There was no soap, no privacy, no moment alone. A full moon cast silver light across the sea. He thought of his field, of the breeze that came through the reeds at night, of the way his son used to grip his finger with chubby hands. He didn't cry. He couldn't. The salt in the air had dried his tears long ago. But something inside him ached in a way the ore never had. A longing, quiet and sharp, relief came in a shared bucket. You waited your turn, kept your eyes low, and did what needed to be done. He didn't ask for more. But war asks for many things, and it asked for him. The summons arrived in spring, not a request. A demand. Athens needed rowers, needed muscle, needed the poor, the hungry, the invisible, men like him. No gold exchanged hands, no promise of land or glory, just orders. A length of thick wood, heavier than any tool he'd used on the farm. The instructors didn't care about his story. They didn't ask his name more than once. By the third, he understood the silence. There was no reward for speaking. Only risk. The officers wanted compliance. They didn't need voices, just bodies that obeyed. So he learned to say nothing. To listen, to observe. He noticed how the officers spoke to each other, but never to the rowers. How decisions were made overhead, and consequences delivered below. They called him you, barked commands, pointed to the bench, and told him to row. And so he did. At first, clumsy, then tired, then sore. The pain came quickly, building in his shoulders and settling deep into the muscles along his spine. Blisters rose on his hands by the second day. By the third, they broke open. He kissed his wife on the forehead, held his young son in his arms for the last time. It stung with each stroke, each grip. He gritted his teeth, said nothing, and kept rowing. Around him, other men suffered just the same. Some younger, wide-eyed, filled with nervous energy. Some older, silent, and already numb. Each one had their own reason for being there, but they shared one truth. Once you step onto a warship, your life is no longer yours. And walk to the city with a bundle of dry bread wrapped in cloth. Training didn't begin with a sword or spear. It began with the oar. There were no bandages, only salt water. The first week taught him the rhythm. The second week taught him the pain. Every morning began the same. One man cracked after 5 days. Over time, the farmer's hands hardened. The blisters turned to calluses. The aches in his arms became background noise. They became something like a crew. Not friends, not comrades, but a chain of silent understanding. One night, as they rested near a rocky shoreline, the farmer sat with his feet in the cool water. A voice beside him broke the silence. Just 3 words. First time, too. It was the old soldier. Some days were better than others. Some meals came with more than just bread. Some nights offered cool winds and a moment to stretch. But the farmer didn't let himself dream. He had a job to do, a bench to fill. A war to row through. The ship left port before sunrise. There was no ceremony, no farewell, just the quiet tug of ropes, the sudden tilt of the deck beneath bare feet, and the long, slow creak as the trireme pushed off into open water. The farmer was already seated, hands on the oar, eyes forward. He didn't know where they were going. No one told the rowers. That was for the strategoid to decide. All he needed to know was the rhythm, the beat, the weight of the oar in his palms. As Athens faded behind them, replaced by the endless sway of the sea, a different kind of silence took over the deck. Just a slow thickening of the clouds, a shift in the wind, the distant groan of something moving in the sky. Buckets were passed hand to hand, trying to bail out what the rain filled. The sails flapped violently, half lowered. The deck tilted again and again. Some men vomited where they sat, dizzy from the motion. Injuries were treated with linen scraps, seawater, and the hope that infection wouldn't set in. Not just for commands, but for mood. Some were cold and efficient. Others were cruel for sport. The older men, those who had rowed on multiple voyages, carried a certain weight. The hull stuck out like a broken rib from the sea. No one spoke, but everyone saw it. Pieces of sail still fluttered on the water. A few birds circled above. Maybe survivors, maybe not. The officer said nothing. The ship kept moving. The drum didn't miss a beat. They knew when to shift, how to brace for impact, which officer could be ignored for a few seconds, and which would notice everything. The breeze cut through damp tunics, raising goosebumps on every exposed inch of skin. The farmer shivered as he tried to sleep, curled on his bench with arms folded tight across his chest. The deck creaked and moaned, wood shifting with the wind. Somewhere, a man whispered a prayer. Somewhere else, someone wept quietly, a sound swallowed quickly by the sea. The new rowers learned fast or suffered. The farmer found himself in the middle. Not green, not seasoned. His son's face, once clear in his mind, had softened into something hazy. His wife's voice came back in pieces. He tried to remember the feel of soil in his hands, the way morning smelled after rain. But the memory slipped away too fast, replaced by salt, by sweat, by wood beneath his fingertips. His new world. He followed the lead of the quiet ones, those who rode steady and spoke less. The ground felt strange, too still, too solid. The oar waited, familiar now. The drum sounded. He pulled, breathed, pulled again. Just rowing until he could no longer hold the oar. Until his body failed or the war ended, whichever came first. The rhythm returned, steady and cruel, like a second heartbeat. He wandered the shoreline in silence, blinking at the wide sky. Then, at the captain's whistle, he returned. No one tried to run. Where would they go? One favored striking men across the back for the slightest delay. Another enjoyed spitting orders through gritted teeth, as if daring the rowers to defy him. No one ever did. Discipline kept the ship moving. Fear kept it silent. When a cut grew red and hot, the man was moved to the edge of the deck and left to rest. If he didn't improve in 2 days, they gave him wine to dull the pain and tossed him overboard. It was cruel, but practical. Every man had to pull his weight. There were no passengers here. No one moved to help. There was nothing to do but wait it out, and the rain came. Sharp, cold, biting against skin. Thunder rolled across the deck like stones in a barrel. The drum started up again, slower than usual, adjusting for the push and pull of the waves. Rowing became a battle of balance. Each stroke had to fight the water's rhythm. Sometimes the oar would slip too far out, catching a gust and jerking sideways. One man near the bow dislocated his shoulder when his oar wrenched back too fast. He bit down on a leather strap while the officer snapped it back into place. Then he kept rowing. The oars were pulled inside. Men crouched low, heads down, shoulders braced. Water ran in streams across the planks, soaking everything. There was no place to hide. This wasn't the silence of routine or exhaustion. It was the silence of unknown waters, of watching the shoreline disappear and realizing just how small you really are. The tempo started slow, as always, letting the rowers find their footing. The farmer fell into the motion quickly. By now, his muscles knew what to do. He pulled, released, pulled again. The sea around them churned as dozens of oars dipped and rose in perfect sequence. The ship surged forward. The ship rocked gently, not yet caught in a current, and the air grew cooler. For a brief moment, it almost felt peaceful. But peace is a rare thing aboard a warship. It never lasts long. The captain's voice broke the quiet, barking a command from above. The drum followed. One beat, then another. Time passed strangely on the open sea. Without trees or buildings to mark it, the hours stretched and curled like smoke. The farmer stopped trying to track it. There was only before the drum and after the drum. In between, he rode. The officers called for breaks when they pleased. Water was passed down the line in wooden cups, warm from the sun and tasting faintly of clay. A handful of olives, a dry heel of bread, then the drum again, and always the rowing. The first storm came on the third day. It didn't start loud. The farmer clenched his jaw and waited. Every muscle in his back screamed for rest, but the officers shouted for order. By morning, the sky had cleared, but the sea was rough. There was no doctor on board. The farmer learned to watch the officers. Below deck, there was a subtle hierarchy among the rowers. It wasn't official, but it mattered. One afternoon, they passed a sunken trireme near the coast. Nights were colder now. He dreamed of home less now. The images had started to blur. The ship docked once, briefly to restock supplies. The crew was allowed to stretch their legs. The farmer stepped onto land with unsteady feet. As they pushed back into open water, the farmer took his seat once again. And beneath it all, a thought he no longer resisted. This was his life now, not a season, not a campaign. Chapter 3. The Battle of Salamis. A sea of screams. They didn't know it would be that day. There had been rumors, of course. Whispers from above deck. The captain had spoken quietly with the strategoi the night before. The officers moved with more purpose. And the sails were taken down early that morning, a sign they'd be rowing into something serious. But below deck, where no sunlight touched the walls, and the only sound was the creak of the hull, nothing was certain until the drum changed. The farmer sat in his usual place, back straight, hands around the oar. His fingers were stiff from the cold, but he said nothing. No one did. The ship had left port just before dawn. They passed other ships, dozens of them, maybe more, all moving toward the narrow strait. The farmer recognized the cliff's dark stone rising out of the sea like old bones. He'd heard the name before. Salamis. The drum started slow. That was normal. A warm-up pace. The ship glided forward, oars dipping in unison. But then it stopped. A silence followed longer than expected. And in that silence, something strange happened. No one spoke, yet everyone understood. It was coming. The battle. Suddenly the drum sounded again. Faster this time. Urgent. The oars pulled hard. The ship surged forward. The officer's voice echoed down into the rowers' quarters. Brace. Stay steady. Row fast. Hold formation. The farmer's arms burned with the force of each stroke. Water slammed against the hull. The oar thumped hard each time it hit the water. Men grunted, sweat dripping from chins and elbows. The ship was moving faster than ever had before. Then the first crash came, not a sharp sound, not like metal against metal. It was a low, thick thud, followed by the groan of wood splitting. The ship had rammed something, or been rammed. The rowers couldn't tell. They couldn't see anything, only feel it. The whole hull shuddered, pitching sideways. The oars jerked in their sockets. One snapped with a crack. The man holding it let out a short gasp. Then came the shouting. Dozens of voices from above across the water. Greek, Persian, commands and cries overlapping, impossible to understand. Above deck, the battle was alive. But below deck, it felt like waiting inside a coffin during an earthquake. More crashes followed. One, and another, and several all at once. The farmer felt the oar vibrate in his hands like it had struck bone. The ship rocked again. Water splashed through the oar ports. Someone yelled. Not a command, just fear. The officer appeared at the head of the rowers' bay, sweat pouring down his face. He barked orders. Harder. Faster. Don't stop. Keep rhythm. You stop. We die. That's what he said. You stop. We die. And so they rowed. Through the shaking, the shouting, the impact of ram against hull, they rowed. The farmer's arms felt like they'd break. His palms were raw, the calluses reopening. But he didn't loosen his grip. No one did. Fear bound them to their task. From above, they heard the ring of metal. Swords, perhaps. Spears. The thud of bodies hitting wood. And then a different sound. A scream, not from above, from one of the rowers. Water was pouring in near the stern. A small crack. Not a hole, not yet, but enough to flood the feet of those nearby. Buckets were passed down. 2 men bailed water while rowing. Impossible, but they tried. The smell changed. Smoke. Something was burning. Not the ship, not yet, but close by. Maybe another trireme. Maybe a Persian one. No one knew. They just kept rowing. Through the oar hole, the farmer caught a glimpse of daylight and chaos. Ships tangled together. Men leaping across decks. Flames licking the edge of a sail. An Athenian soldier swinging a spear. A Persian falling backward into the sea. It was gone in a flash, then only wood and sea again. The officer shouted again. Turn. Starboard. The drum changed rhythm. The oars shifted. A tight maneuver. They pulled the ship hard to the right. One man missed the cue. His oar tangled with another. Both men were hit with the stick. No time for apologies. Another crash. This one louder. Close. The ship jolted forward. Someone fell from their bench. An officer barked for them to get up or get left. The man scrambled back into place, hands bleeding from the fall. The farmer's breath was shallow. His ribs ached. He couldn't tell if it was the rowing or the fear. Maybe both. He closed his eyes for a moment, just long enough to forget what he was doing. But the oar dragged, and the man beside him elbowed his side. "Wake up." The sun had risen higher now. The light filtered through the gaps in the hull. It caught on floating dust, turning it golden. For a moment, everything looked soft, peaceful, but outside, the war kept screaming. The ship struck again. This time, the jolt came with a cheer from above. Greek voices. Victory, perhaps. A successful ram. No one below cheered. They couldn't spare the breath. Then it happened. A ship beside them split. A Persian by the colors. Its hull cracked like dry bark. Men spilled into the water. Some swam. Some didn't. A few tried to board the Greek ship, but were knocked back with spears. One climbed halfway up before an axe came down. The farmer didn't see it, only heard the thud, the splash. He didn't want to look anymore. The drum slowed, then stopped. A signal. Pause. The ship drifted, silent for the first time in hours. Rowers dropped their oars, gasping. Some curled over their knees. Others just stared ahead, not blinking. The farmer flexed his hands. They shook. He looked down. A blood, not just his. The handle of the oar was smeared red. His palms were cracked, raw. His forearms trembled. He tried to wipe them clean on his tunic. It didn't help. A loud creak above. The captain announced that the enemy was retreating, that the day was theirs. Cheers rang out. On deck, it must have felt like triumph. Below, the rowers said nothing. The farmer leaned back against the wall. He could still hear the drum in his head, even though it had stopped. The beat, the rhythm, the pounding that had carried him through terror. It stayed with him, echoing in his chest. He didn't feel victorious. He felt used, hollow, a body that had done what it was told. And would do it again? Because this was war, not the kind sung about by poets. The real kind, and it lived in places no one ever saw. The smoke didn't clear until midday. The sea still smelled of it long after the flames had died down, and it mixed with the stench of sweat, blood, and burning pitch. There was no moment of silence for the dead, no victory speech, no solemn blessing, only the captain's firm voice echoing from above, announcing that the Persians had been driven off, that Athens had prevailed, that the gods had favored them. The words floated down like ash, hollow. The rowers had heard these phrases before, but today they landed with a strange weight. A few scrubbed at bloodstains that wouldn't come out. It tasted better than anything they'd eaten weeks, though no one said so aloud. Was it worth it? No one answered. Not because they didn't know, but because there were too many answers. The farmer helped carry timber from the beach, hauling planks up to the ship under the watchful eyes of the officers. Nails were hammered in. Ropes were tied. Buckets of pitch were brought out to seal the cracks in the hull. It was work, but it was different from rowing. It was slower, more tangible. He could see progress, see the ship taking shape again. Still, he found no comfort in it. He stared into the fire, watching the embers shift. For some, perhaps it was. For others, definitely not. But in that moment, the question hung in the air, unanswered and heavy. They ate quietly, the way men do after something has ended, but not really ended. The officers drank wine from shared cups, laughing and recounting the more dramatic moments of the battle. The rowers stayed apart, listening in silence. Maybe it was the knowledge that this life, brutal and thankless as it was, had become their rhythm. The captain gave a short speech about honor and sacrifice. The men lined up. The farmer found his bench. He sat, gripped the oar, waited for the signal, their measure of time, their place. After enough time spent rowing, the oar becomes part of you. The ship becomes your world. And even when you dream of escape, your body remembers where it belongs. The farmer looks straight ahead, not at the men beside him, not at the officer, not at the horizon, just at the back of the man in front of him. The same view he'd had for weeks. The same one he'd have for weeks more. One had a shattered leg. Another had been burned. They were left behind in the care of local villagers. The officers said they would be taken care of, but the look in their eyes said otherwise. Everyone knew that once you left the ship, you were forgotten, replaced. The benches never stayed empty for long. One man stood waist deep, staring out at the horizon without moving. The blisters hadn't healed. The pain hadn't gone. But he pulled anyway. The farmer watched them without speaking. He had no energy for words. His muscles still remembered the rhythm. His arms twitched with the memory of the drumbeat. He felt like he was still rowing, even now, with his hands empty and his feet on dry land. They had survived, yes, but none of them felt triumphant. They were sore, bruised, aching. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The fire crackled between them. The flames threw long shadows across the sand. And yet, beneath all of that, what they felt most was numb. The farmer remained on his bench, motionless, hands resting in his lap. The officers said it was for rest and repairs, but everyone knew it was more than that. Some of the ships hadn't made it back. Others had drifted in late, dragging broken sails or leaking from the hull. The men aboard those were in worse shape. Some carried wounded soldiers over their shoulders. Some brought back nothing at all. He had unwrapped a strip of cloth from the hem of his tunic to bandage the deeper cuts on his fingers. His knees nearly gave out. He hadn't realized how much effort it would take just to stand. His feet felt strange, too light, as if the ground itself had no interest in supporting him. He walked stiffly to the edge of the beach, away from the others, and sat beneath a twisted tree. For the first time in days, he had space around him. He could see the sky clearly, but even that didn't feel real. It felt like a trick, something temporary. He didn't trust it. His palms had gone from calloused, cracked to torn in the course of one long morning. Around him, the other rowers sat, slumped, quiet, not asleep, not awake, somewhere in between. The officers gave no words of comfort. That evening, the ship anchored near a small island. When the farmer stepped off the ship and onto the sand, he winced. Nearby, some of the men stripped and waded into the water, washing away the sweat and grime. Food was passed around that night, more than usual. A thick porridge made from barley and lentils and a few slices of salted fish. Later, near the edge of the camp, one of the younger rowers asked a question. His voice was barely above a whisper. In the days that followed, the repairs began. A few of the men had been injured too badly to return. One night, while the others slept, the farmer sat by the fire with the old soldier. Finally, the old man spoke. You ever think about just walking away? The farmer didn't answer right away. Every day, he said. After a while, the old man nodded. Me too. But neither of them moved. It wasn't about duty, or loyalty, or fear. It was something else, something deeper. The next morning, the drum sounded again. The repairs were finished. Supplies had been restocked. And just like that, the ship was moving again. The water slapped against the hull. The wind pushed gently at their backs. The officer paced between the rows. And as the drum beat returned steady and low, the farmer's hands tightened on the oar. Because that's what he was now. Chapter 4. Rations, Rest, and Rainwater. The war didn't stop, but it slowed. After the clash at Salamis, after the shouting and burning and endless rowing, the ship moved more carefully. There was always another mission, another patrol, another message to deliver. But now there were quiet stretches of water, long days beneath a cloudless sky, when the only sound was the rhythm of the oars and the occasional cry of a gull circling overhead. It was during these quiet days that the weight of the ship settled most heavily on the men inside it. Aboard a trireme, rest was not real rest. It was a pause, a lull in duty, a moment to stretch your legs without being ordered to run. The farmer learned this quickly. After each rowing shift, there was no place to collapse. You stayed where you were. Maybe shifted to lean against the hull. Maybe stretched your legs beneath the bench ahead, but you never really relaxed. The ship was too narrow, too full, too alive with creaking wood and the scent of 50 tired men packed shoulder to shoulder. Food was brought in baskets from the officers' stores. It was never hot. Just dry barley cakes, hard and cracked around the edges, soaked briefly in seawater to soften. Olives when they had them. Once a week, if fortune allowed, a scoop of lentil paste with herbs served cold in a shared bowl. The farmer didn't complain. Complaining did nothing. Besides, his stomach had learned to expect very little. Hunger wasn't a sharp pain anymore. Just a steady presence, like the rocking of the ship or the ache in his knees. Water came in clay jars, carefully sealed and rationed. Each man received a cup in the morning and another in the afternoon, passed hand to hand by a boy too young to row. The jars were stored below deck, away from the sun, but the water still grew warm by midday. It tasted faintly of clay and salt. Sometimes, if it had been stored too long, it smelled of mildew. Still, it was precious. Not a drop was wasted. Men tilted their heads back and let the water run slowly over their tongues, swallowing carefully. The ones who drank too quickly sometimes got sick. The body learned patience in many ways. When supplies ran low, they harvested rain. Sailcloth was stretched across the deck to collect the water, funneled into jars and sealed tight. A thin man was always stationed nearby to swat away birds or insects. When rain didn't come, they rationed harder. And when that failed, they stopped at islands, small coves with trickling streams, and filled what they could. There was no guarantee of safety. Pirates, enemy scouts, or unfriendly locals were always a risk, but water was life. The captain made the call, and the men followed. Waste was handled without ceremony. A shared bucket, carried from the rear of the ship, used when needed and dumped overboard when full. There was no privacy, no shame, just function. Some used cloth to clean themselves. Others, just water. The sea carried everything away. What it left behind was the smell, not sharp, not vile, just constant. A layer of human presence that clung to the ship as tightly as the ropes. Sleep was scattered and shallow. Men napped between rowing shifts, heads resting on folded arms or the shoulder of the man beside them. The deck offered no padding, no softness. Only wood warmed by the sun and cooled by the sea. You slept in your clothes, often wet, always stiff. Dreams came in fragments, a familiar voice, a doorway, a stretch of road leading home. Then the drum would sound, or a shout would ring out, and the dream would vanish before it ever finished. There was no concept of night in the usual sense. The ship operated by need, not by sun or stars. Sometimes they rode in the dark. Stars overhead and lanterns hung from the mast, casting flickering shadows on the deck. Other times they drifted, letting the current carry them, while men lay in rows like logs, unmoving. The farmer learned to sleep sitting up, not because it was comfortable, but because it was practical. and over time, practicality became habit. Clothing was simple, a single tunic, often stained and torn. When it became too worn, the quartermaster issued another from a locked chest. Shoes were rare. Most rowers went barefoot, their feet toughened by salt and splinters. On cold nights, they wrapped strips of fabric around their legs. It wasn't enough, but it helped. Once, during a lull in travel, the ship docked beside a merchant vessel carrying cloth and grain. The captain traded for dates and dried figs. The crew received a few each. The farmer bit into his slowly, savoring the sweetness, the way the sugars dissolved on his tongue. He hadn't tasted anything like it in weeks. For a moment, he was a boy again, sitting in the shade of a fig tree, watching bees circle above his head. Then the wind shifted and the scent of the ship returned, and a moment passed. Boredom was a companion. It came when the wind was still and the water glassy, when there were no duties and the officers paced in silence. Some men carved shapes into the wood of their benches. Others scratched marks into the hull to count the days. A few recited poems they half remembered, lines of Homer or Sappho spoken softly into the air. No one asked them to stop. Sometimes men talked, quietly and never when the officers were near. Stories about home, about lost loves, about sons growing up without them. The farmer listened more than he spoke. He didn't want to say his son's name aloud. It made the ache worse. But he liked hearing others speak. It reminded him that they were still men, not just parts of a machine. There were rituals, small ones, a lucky coin tied to a belt, a whispered prayer to Poseidon before each voyage, a carved stone rubbed before sleep. These things didn't change the outcome, but they gave shape to the days, gave the men a sense of order in a world that had very little. Once a man died in his sleep, quietly, no illness, no injury, just slipped away. They found him at dawn, slumped against the hull, eyes open. The officer covered him with a blanket and said nothing. The captain allowed the ship to stop briefly. They lowered him into the water with a short blessing. Then the drum sounded again, and the men rowed. Cleanliness was not a matter of pride aboard the Trireme. It was a matter of survival. Dirt alone didn't kill a man, but what followed often did. Infection, fever, sores that wouldn't close. The men learned early on that the sea was their only bath in salt, their only cleanser. Each time the ship stopped near shore, some would wade into the water, rubbing their arms and legs with handfuls of wet sand. It was rough and left the skin red, but it scraped off the worst of the grime. Salt stung in the wounds, but salt also kept the wounds from turning black. The old soldier swore by it. "Let the sea eat it," he would say, pressing his hand to a split knuckle and watching the blood mix with seawater. Lice were common. The farmer could feel them sometimes, crawling along his scalp or the back of his neck. At night, he scratched until it bled. Some men shaved their heads with dull blades to make it easier, but even that didn't stop the itching. The tunics were worse. Washed only when they were soaked by rain or dipped in a river, they stiffened over time, carrying the odor of weeks' worth of sweat and skin. No one noticed any more, or rather, no one said anything. Complaining never helped. Illness came quietly, and it spread fast. A cough in the morning might become a fever by night. When one man grew pale, the others started watching. He would be given more water, a little extra bread. If the sickness passed, he returned to his bench. If it worsened, the officer marked his name. The worst cases were laid flat near the stern, where they wouldn't be stepped on, their bodies shaded by a tarp. The rest kept rowing. Sometimes the sick recovered. Sometimes they didn't. When a man died, his body was wrapped in a cloth, if one could be spared, and lowered into the sea. There were no songs. Just a short pause, and then the drum again. The sea always made room for another. The ship was never still for long. Supplies were thin, so they stopped where they could. Small islands, hidden coves, river mouths where fresh water trickled from rocks. The farmer looked forward to these moments, not for rest, not even for food, but because the air smelled different, sweeter, like moss and flowers and whetstone, like something that hadn't been breathed 1,000 times before. He'd close his eyes and breathe it in until the officer called him back. On shore, men washed their clothes in shallow pools, beating them against rocks. They hung them on low branches or lines strung between spears. The tunics never came clean. Not really, but they came out lighter, less stiff, more tolerable. On these days, the ship looked almost peaceful. Oars propped against rocks. Helmets left to dry. Men sitting in silence, chewing on roots or plucking lice from their sleeves. No one laughed. But for a few hours, no one barked orders either. One of the men on the crew carried a small flute. It was cracked and missing a section, but he still played it when the officers weren't watching. Soft notes drifting across the water like whispers. The farmer didn't know the tune, but he listened. The music reminded him of summer nights at home. Not the exact ones. Those were too far away, but the feeling of them. The way the light faded slowly. Sound of insects in the tall grass. The peace of knowing the day's work was done. Not every man found peace so easily. A few became restless. They paced the deck during rest hours. They picked at their skin. They spoke too much or not at all. The farmer watched one man unravel over several days, becoming quieter, then louder, then silent again. One morning, he stood up mid-row and shouted that he could still see his wife's face. He wept as two men pulled him down. By evening, he was gone. The captain said he'd been moved to another ship. No one believed that. To pass time, the rowers told stories. Some were real, others weren't. One man claimed he'd once punched a Spartan. Another said he saw a giant fish with eyes as big as shields. The truth didn't matter. The telling did. It filled the space between duties. It made the time bend just a little. The farmer shared little. He listened. But once, when prompted, he told of the season when frost came early and wiped out half his harvest. How he'd lived on dry onions and weak wine for 2 months, trying to make it through. The others nodded. They understood that kind of story. It wasn't exciting, but it was familiar. There was no real privacy aboard the ship. Even thinking felt exposed sometimes. So the men found privacy in habits. The farmer had a smooth stone he rubbed between his fingers when anxious. Another man whispered numbers to himself, counting every stroke, every beat, every breath. The old soldier hummed under his breath, always the same tune, just loud enough to hear if you sat beside him. One of the few comforts came from the sea itself. Not the water they drank or bathed in, but the sound of it. At night, when the ship drifted and the oars rested, the sea would speak in gentle slaps and swirls. The farmer would lie on the deck and listen. It reminded him that the world was larger than this ship, that beyond the planks and ropes and sweat, there was still something vast and patient. The sea did not rush. It did not cry out. It simply moved. And so did they, day after day, stroke after stroke. Small routines became anchors, cleaning the oar handle, rearranging a sleeping mat, sharing a fig, listening to the sky. Even the smallest thing like watching a cloud drift past the mast could become a moment worth holding on to. In these quiet ways they endured, not because they were strong, not because they had to, but because there was no other choice. Chapter 5. Storms and Shipwrecks. At the mercy of the gods, they were not far from the coast when the sky began to change. The sun, which had burned so hot that morning, dimmed slowly behind a sheet of high white clouds. The wind, which had pushed steadily from the west for 3 days, stopped, just like that. As if it had grown tired, the surface of the sea flattened. The gulls that had followed the ship all morning vanished. The sea, calm just minutes before, rose up in swells. Water poured through the oar holes. The farmer felt it soak his feet, then his knees, not above, but to the east, near the cliffs. The flash lit the sea in silver. For a moment he saw everything, the curve of the waves, the dark shapes of other ships tossed in the distance, the open mouths of men yelling into the wind. Then darkness again, then rain. The world became noise and motion, water and sky, wind and panic. The ship felt alive, but barely. It groaned with every wave, shuddered with every gust, creaked like old bones beneath the weight of the storm. At times, it felt like it would tip completely. Then it would shift back, find its balance again, and lurch forward. The ship tilted hard to one side. An oar was ripped from someone's grip and vanished into the sea. He stared out at the sea, breathing shallow. Around him, the others did the same. No cheers. No celebration. Just exhaustion. Just survival. Others lay flat and stared at the sky. The farmer found a patch of dry grass and sat, hands in his lap. They shared dried figs from the stores and passed around the smallest cup of wine. It wasn't a feast, but it was something. His muscles still trembled from the effort. His mind still echoed with the sound of the wind. The water rose faster than they could throw it out. The farmer didn't move. Not yet. He needed a moment to remember he was alive. Then slipped on the soaked planks, crawling instead of walking. The benches filled. The oars lifted. The farmer would sit in his place, hands cracked and eyes forward. But tonight he allowed himself to feel the earth beneath him, solid, unmoving, briefly his. A barrel came loose and rolled across the deck, smashing into a bench. Just a thought, repeated like a heartbeat. Not yet. Not like this. Not in a sea. The officer near the farmer tried to catch it and was knocked backward. He didn't get up. Men began to move again, slowly, stiffly. Checking rope, bailing out what water remained, binding wounds. One man's arm was broken. It didn't hate them. It didn't punish them. It simply moved. When its movements crushed ships or scattered men, it felt nothing. And yet, every man aboard the Trireme knew that they belonged to it. Their fate, whether they made it to shore or not, rested in the tilt of a wave, in the mood of the wind, in the whim of a god who didn't speak. Another had been pinned under a barrel and could no longer stand. A third was missing. The man scrambled to grab the chain that anchored his bench. He crawled toward the main mast, tied down the ropes that had come loose, pulled a tarp across the supply crates. His hands bled from the rope burns. He didn't notice. The farmer sat in his place, hand on the oar, and noticed the stillness. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. Like the world had taken a breath and was waiting. A few of the older men looked up from their benches, not at the sky, but at each other. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. The captain stepped to the front of the deck. His voice was calm, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Then it came again, stronger. The ship rocked slightly. A groan from the hull, and then the wind found its voice. It screamed through the rigging. The mast bent with the force of it. The sail, half lowered, snapped open like a whip, then tore straight down the middle. Orders to tighten the ropes, check the sail lines, secure the supply crates. Below deck, the rowers remained seated. They could hear the tension in the footsteps above, the way the officers moved faster, the way the sailors tied knots with hands that shook a little. The first gust came as a whisper, just enough to lift the edge of a tunic. Shouts from above. The officers shouting to each other, to the crew, to the gods. There was no rowing now. The oars were pulled inside and secured to the floor. Men braced themselves with arms and legs, gripping anything they could. The farmer pressed his back against the hull and stared ahead, watching water pour from the seams of the deck above. His heart pounded, but he didn't speak. No one did. Lightning cracked across the sky. The rain came sideways. It struck skin like gravel. It filled the ship like a bucket. Buckets were passed, but it was hopeless. The farmer reached for the man, but was pulled away by another. No time, the old soldier growled. Help the ship, so he did. The storm lasted hours, or maybe only one. It was impossible to tell. The farmer prayed, not loudly, not with ceremony. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the storm passed. The wind slowed. The rain lightened. The waves shrank. The clouds parted. And for the first time in hours, the ship floated quietly. They never found his body. Just his oar, drifting beside the ship, the handle still wrapped in a strip of cloth. The farmer sat on the deck, soaked to the bone, shirt torn, knees scraped raw. Above, the officers began shouting orders again. The captain pointed toward the nearest island. They would dock there for repairs. When they reached the island, the ship creaked as it was pulled onto the shore. The men climbed off slowly. Some kissed the ground. That night, they built fires from driftwood. They dried their clothes on branches. One of the older men looked into the flames and said softly, "Poseidon let us live today." No one answered, but many nodded. The sea was not cruel. It was indifferent. And that indifference was what made it dangerous. Tomorrow, the ship would sail again. The ropes would be tied. And in that stillness, he closed his eyes. Chapter 6. Dock Duty. Building and repairing your own prison. When the trireme reached shore, the men didn't cheer. Shore didn't mean comfort. Shore meant work. The deck might stop swaying, and the sea might grow quiet, but the ship never truly rested. And neither did the crew. There were repairs to make, sails to mend, water to haul, wood to scrape. You didn't row on land, but you pulled just the same. The farmer stepped off the ship with stiff legs, his knees locked at strange angles, trained by too many hours bent over the oar. His shoulders ached from where the beam had pressed against his spine. His tunic clung to him, damp with sweat and sea salt. He glanced at the trees beyond the cove, dark green and still, then lowered his eyes. He wouldn't walk there. He would stay on the beach like everyone else. The forest was for birds. The beach was for men like him. The captain barked assignments. The voice was loud but not cruel. It didn't need to be. Every man already knew what was expected. The hull had cracked near the stern, where the storm had slammed the ship against a drifting spar. A plank had come loose. 3 benches had warped from water damage. The oars needed oiling. The sail had torn straight down the center and would take the better part of a day to stitch. Men broke into groups. Some carried buckets to the stream farther inland, filling them one at a time and hauling them back over uneven stone. Others rolled the sailcloth out onto the beach, pinned the edges with rocks, and began the long, careful task of sewing it shut. The farmer joined the team hauling wood. They had found a stack of stored planks nearby left behind by a previous fleet. Maybe left on purpose, maybe forgotten. It didn't matter. The wood was dry. That was enough. Each board was long and rough. 2 men to carry one. The farmer took the front end. Another man took the back. Together they trudged over the sand, bare feet slipping on the loose pebbles. The sun pressed down from above. No shade, no pause. Just the rhythm of labor. One board, then another after that. When they reached the ship, the carpenter was already at work, fitting a replacement plank into place. He tapped it with a hammer, checking the sound, listening for the echo of weakness. The farmer stood nearby, sweat dripping from his chin, and waited to be told what to do next. The carpenter pointed at a pile of old nails. Sort them. Clean the rust from the heads. He sat on a rock, picked up a nail, and began scraping. The air smelled of pitch and pine. The sweet scent of resin from the trees mixed with the sharp bite of salt air. Somewhere inland, a bird called out, a thin, lonely sound. The farmer kept his head down and worked. Dock duty wasn't about fixing just the ship. It was about preparing it to break again. The rowers knew this. The officers knew this. Everything they repaired now would splinter soon enough. Every rope they tied would fray again. The sea took its toll on all things. The ship was no exception. By midday, the farmer's hands were raw again. Not from rowing, but from rope, splinters, and nails. The skin peeled in places. Blisters formed in new spots. He flexed his fingers. They still worked. That was enough. Food came in the afternoon. A pot of lentils, boiled with bits of dried onion and salt. No plates, just a shared bowl and chunks of bread passed around to scoop the paste. The farmer took his share, sat beneath a sloping tree, and chewed slowly. The bread was tough. The lentils were soft and gritty. He didn't mind. He was too tired to care. After the meal, some of the men dipped into the sea, washing the grime from their arms. The farmer followed, wading knee-deep into the water, letting the waves lap against his legs. He rubbed his arms with wet sand, scraped the dirt from beneath his nails, then sat on a flat stone and let the sun dry his skin. His tunic clung to him. He didn't bother changing. The sail repair team made good progress. The seam down the middle had been closed with thick cord, looped tightly and tied every few inches. The farmer passed by and watched them work careful fingers, eyes squinting against the glare, legs stretched to brace the cloth. They didn't speak much, just pointed, tied, cut, and kept going. By early evening, the major repairs were complete. The new plank held. The mast ropes had been replaced. The sail folded and returned to the deck. A few tasks remained: sharpening blades, oiling pulleys, replacing a missing oarlock, but the captain allowed the men to rest for a while. Rest, of course, didn't mean leisure. It meant you weren't being ordered. It meant you could lie down without punishment. The farmer found a patch of dry grass and stretched out. He looked at the sky. The clouds had thinned. The light was golden, slanting across the trees. He exhaled through his nose and closed his eyes. But even with his eyes shut, he could still see the shape of the ship in his mind. Every curve, every crack, every joint he had touched that day, it stayed with him like a brand, like a second home that never truly welcomed you, but never let you leave. The night passed without event. Fires were lit, meals eaten, stories exchanged in low voices. The farmer sat near the edge of the group, chewing on a fig and listening. One man spoke of his wife's cooking. Another described the hill behind his father's farm. Someone else said they would join the temple guards after the war. No one argued. It was easy to dream when the fire was warm and the stars were out. But morning came, as it always did. The officers called the men to order. The ship was ready. Time to launch. The farmer returned to his bench. He checked the new plank near his feet. Solid. He gripped the oar, familiar, and when the drum began, slow and steady, he rowed. Just as he had built the ship, now he moved it. He had repaired his prison with his own hands, and he carried it with his own strength. Even when the ship was whole again, the rowers still carried the weight of its damage, not just in the cracks they'd patched or the ropes they'd retied, but in their bodies. Words were saved for orders, for short warnings, for work. The pain was carried like breath, constant, private, and rarely noticed unless it failed. You learned to live with it, to stop measuring discomfort. A hut with thick walls, a stone hearth, a door that closed from the inside. He imagined sitting beside a fire, the sound of boiling water, the dull crackle of dry wood. But when he woke, the smell of pitch still clung to his nose. When a man drove a nail into the hull, his eyes followed it in deeper than the wood. When another scraped barnacles from the underside, his jaw clenched as he worked. They knew, they all knew. The creak of the hull still hummed in his ears. Dreams could wander, but the body remembered. Dried meat, bread soaked in oil, a few pickled onions. One of the sailors produced a deck of bone-carved playing pieces. They scratched lines into the sand and played quietly, murmuring bets and rules. The farmer watched, but didn't join. He found no comfort in games. Not anymore. The soil was rocky, baked hard by the sun. His hands blistered again within minutes. It looked meaningless, a scar in the earth, but it had made a difference. That was the danger of such work. The officers knew it did no harm. The farmer had never done it. He didn't need the ship to remember him. It already did, in its own way. It taught you to accept your own usefulness in small ways. It taught you that even suffering could serve a purpose. In the pull of the ropes tied just tight enough to hold. In the small, smooth groove where his heel rested each time he sat. Each item placed carefully, weight balanced, spaces filled. It was a ritual by now, a dance. Checked the mast, tested the wheel, ran his hand along the rail, then gave the order. Each man knew where to stand, when to lift, how to pass. The process was smooth, wordless. He had sanded it himself. Tied the rope at its base. Checked the socket pin twice for cracks. And once you believed that, it was harder to resist the next task, and the next. The officer tossed him a small metal spade and said nothing. He dug for 3 hours. His shoulders burned. His legs cramped, but the trench held, the water drained. And the ship floated easier because of it. You ever wonder how many men built this thing before us? If it wasn't broken or bleeding, you moved forward. That was the rule. Their hands bore splinters from new planks. Their shoulders ached from hoisting the mast upright. Their backs creaked like the hull itself. Each repair left its mark. A scar for every seam. A bruise for every board. When it lost its shape, they bent it back. And when they died or disappeared or were discharged, someone else took their place. The ship did not remember their names, but it carried their labor in every nail, every knot, every grain of wood worn smooth by years of hands. The farmer didn't speak of these things. Neither did the others. It was strange, he thought, how easily the ship became part of them. They cursed it when it leaked, cursed it when it pitched, cursed it when it baked them beneath the sun. But they also touched it constantly, ran fingers along the grain of the oars. The fact that they were making something stronger than it had been before. Each time they repaired the hull, reinforced the joints, sharpened the blades, they were not just preserving the ship. They were improving it. They were shaping their own prison into something more durable, something that would carry them farther, endure more storms, take them deeper into the war. Knocked their knuckles on the beams to test the sound, stepped carefully to avoid weakening a plank. They didn't trust it, but they knew it. Like you know the feel of your own knees or the ache in your jaw when you retired. There were times after long days of rowing and longer nights of hauling supplies when the farmer dreamed of building something different. There was something else, too. A quiet understanding that never made it into the stories told around the fire. It was a strange thing to build your own cage and make it sturdier with each stroke of the hammer. The younger men didn't talk about it, not directly, but it hung in the air during rest, during the long silences after meals. One day, during a brief stop at a small outpost, the farmer was assigned to dig a drainage trench near the waterline. He sat beside the trench afterward, staring at the line of disturbed soil. That night, the crew shared a meal under a sliver of moon. The old soldier sat beside him. He said nothing for a long time, then spoke without turning his head. The farmer nodded. Sometimes. They're all gone now, the old man said. But the ship's still here. That was the truth of it. The ship outlived them all. When it cracked, they patched it. When it rotted, they scraped and sealed. Some men carved their initials into the hull, just below the bench. It was frowned upon, but not strictly punished. In the sound it made when the oars struck water, that was the mark he left behind. The next morning, the crew loaded the ship again. Barrels of grain, jars of water, sacks of cloth and rope. And when it was done, the captain walked the deck once more. The ship slid back into the sea. The farmer took his place, gripped the oar, felt the roughness of the wood beneath his hands. It was his oar, his bench, his ship, his prison, and he had made it stronger than before. Chapter 7. Secrets of the Antikythera mechanism. Long after the ship was gone, after the sails had rotted, after the oars had splintered, after the names of its crew had been forgotten, something remained beneath the sea. Something quiet. Something delicate. Not a sword, not a shield, not a golden coin, but a box, rusted and half buried in the sand. A piece of bronze, small and strange, resting where light barely reached. It would be thousands of years before anyone found it again. When sponge divers stumbled upon the wreck off the coast of Antikythera in 1901, they were looking for cargo, amphorae, statues, jewels, the usual offerings of a sunken merchant ship, and they found them, marble arms still reaching from the seabed, coins crusted in coral. But then there was something else, something confusing. A lump of bronze, green from age, covered in incrustation, but clearly not just a broken tool. It had teeth, tiny deer-like teeth, unnatural in their precision. A man held it in his hand and turned it over once, then again, and in that moment, history tilted just slightly on its axis. At first, no one knew what it was. It didn't look like much. Just a corroded plate. But when it was clean, when X-rays revealed its inner structure, the questions began. The bronze wasn't random. It was layered, organized, measured, a mechanism. Inside were gears, many of them. Interlocking, deliberate, each one shaped to fit another. Some were larger than a coin, others barely larger than a fingernail. They weren't decorative. They were functional, but functional for what? That was the mystery. Over time, the pieces were studied, scanned, reconstructed. The fragments whispered answers, but never all at once. It became clear that this was not a simple machine. Not even just a clock. It was more than that. Much more. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be called, was an ancient Greek device designed to track the movements of the heavens. The sun, the moon, the stars, eclipses, phases, cycles. It could predict the dates of the Olympic Games. It could model the orbit of the moon, adjusting for its irregular speed with a special gear, the first known example of a mathematical correction built into a machine. It did all of this not with wires or screens or batteries, but with bronze and logic. With gear teeth carved by hand. With ratios calculated by minds working under candlelight, without telescopes, without electricity, without modern tools of any kind. It was not a toy. It was not a fluke. It was engineering. Real, advanced, almost impossibly refined. And yet, it had vanished from memory. The Greeks never wrote about it. No manual, no engraving, no copy found elsewhere. The mechanism was buried by time, forgotten in a shipwreck, remembered only by the sea. For the men who once rode beneath that ship's deck, the mechanism meant little. They would not have touched it, would not have been allowed to see it. A precious object like that would have been stored carefully, sealed in a box, guarded by men who wore cloaks and spoke in measured tones. Men who studied the sky and read numbers scratched into wax tablets. Men who believed that knowledge could be shaped like stone, spun like a wheel. But still, in its own way, the mechanism belonged to them. Not because they understood it, but because they carried it. Literally, their backs bore the weight of the ship that held it. Their hands rowed it from port to port, across hundreds of miles of open water, never knowing what sat in the hold above their heads. It moved with them, slept above them, waited in silence. It's strange to think of it now, this fragile thing of bronze and gears, gliding through the Aegean on a bed of grain and cloth and jars of oil, held, aloft by sweat and calluses and the rhythm of 100 oars. It's easy to romanticize it, to imagine that the Greeks had unlocked some secret of the cosmos, encoded it in metal, and sent it sailing toward the future. But for most of the men aboard that ship, the stars were just lights above the sea, not puzzles, not maps, just something to row beneath. The genius behind the mechanism came from a different world, a world of philosophers and mathematicians, of temples and symposiums, of names that were carved into stone and preserved in books. The man who designed the mechanism, whoever he was, likely never set foot on a warship. His hands were probably soft, his time measured in hours, not beats of a drum. He wrote in ink, not sweat, drew circles, not calluses. But somehow, his work ended up on a ship with men who couldn't read his name. And still, those men carried it, protected it, preserved it without knowing. And now it is those unknown hands we remember most. The mechanism is silent now, sealed behind glass in a museum. But once it moved, it ticked. It turned in rhythm with the sky. And for a time, it rode the waves on a ship of wood and salt and bone, cradled by men who rode without glory, slept without comfort, and built an empire that forgot their names. Even so, something of them remains. Not in the stars, but in the teeth of a gear, in the way metal fits to metal, in the quiet fact that greatness often rests on the backs of those who were never meant to see it. There is a kind of reverence that comes with studying something that no one was meant to find. The Antikythera mechanism is not just an artifact, it's a question. A whisper from a time when the universe was drawn not on chalkboards, but on bronze wheels, no larger than your palm. A time when understanding the sky required not just imagination, but patience and courage. The man who designed it is gone. We don't have his name. His writings, no portrait, no signature left behind. Just a design silent, intricate, unreasonably precise. That's how history remembers him. Through the angles of gears and the careful balance of rotational teeth. He knew something about the stars, something that others forgot, and he built it into metal because he believed that knowledge could be made permanent. But the sea has a way of erasing even the boldest certainties. For centuries, the world didn't know the mechanism existed. It sat on the ocean floor, broken and barnacled, like so many other things lost to the tides. Wars rose and fell. Kingdoms crumbled. Languages disappeared. And the mechanism remained, waiting. It waited longer than any man who had ever seen it. Longer than the civilization that built it. It waited in silence like a book with no reader. And when it was finally found, when it was pulled from the deep by men who didn't yet understand what they were holding, it didn't announce itself with fanfare or glory. It didn't sparkle or shine. It didn't reveal its secrets all at once. It crumbled. It flaked. It resisted interpretation, as if reminding us that the knowledge it carried had a price and that we had nearly let it slip away forever. The farmer who once rode beneath it had never heard the word mechanism. He could barely spell his own name, but he knew of the stars in his own way. He had seen them reflected in the sea. He had watched the moon rise during night watches, soft and golden over the horizon. He didn't chart their movements or measure their angles, but they lived in his sky, just the same. The difference was that he followed them without needing to understand them. The men who built the mechanism, however, believed that understanding was power. That if you could predict the path of the moon, you could time your planting better, time your sailing. Know when eclipses would darken the sun. Know when tides would shift. Know when the gods might speak. Because to them, the sky wasn't just beautiful, it was a map, a message, something that could be read, decoded, interpreted. And the mechanism was their way of doing just that, not with prayers, but with precision. Not with sacrifice, but with mathematics. It's easy to think of the ancient world as simple, as crude. But this device reminds us that intelligence doesn't begin with modernity. It doesn't belong to our time alone. Genius is older than steam, older than gunpowder, older than even the alphabet, if you know where to look. The Greeks had already begun turning the universe into patterns, measuring time in cycles, and using the positions of heavenly bodies to organize their lives. The Antikythera mechanism was just the most extraordinary result of that thinking. And yet, for all its complexity, it was not mass-produced. It was singular. A prototype, perhaps, or a one-off commission for a wealthy philosopher or a temple priest. Maybe it sat on a table in a quiet study, surrounded by scrolls and flickering oil lamps. Maybe it was shown to students, turned slowly to demonstrate the relationship between sun and moon. Maybe it was never finished. We don't know why it was on that ship. Was it being transported to a new patron? Was it hidden during a time of war? Was it stolen? Sold? Abandoned? Whatever the reason, it ended up at the bottom of the sea, forgotten by the world that made it, remembered only when the world was ready to ask again. It makes you wonder what else has been lost. What other wonders were never recovered? What genius has been buried beneath centuries of dust and water and war? Not everything leaves behind a trace. Some things disappear completely, like dreams forgotten before morning. And yet, some things endure. The Antikythera mechanism is one of those things. Fragile, broken, but still here. It doesn't function anymore. The gears no longer turn. The dials are still. But even in silence, it speaks. It tells us that long ago, someone believed in the order of the stars. Believed enough to build a machine from nothing but metal and imagination. That belief, that quiet determination, crosses oceans of time to reach us. And when we look at it now, turning slowly on its display, we see more than bronze and rust. We see evidence of a mind that saw the chaos of the universe and dared to organize it. A mind that believed everything had a pattern, even if that pattern could only be revealed with 1,000 tiny teeth turning in the dark. As the farmer rode beneath the hold that held this mechanism, he likely never knew it existed. But now, the world remembers them both. The thinker and the laborer, one with ink-stained fingers, the other with calloused hands, one who charted the heavens, one who held the oar. Together, they carried the weight of a world that believed the sky could be measured. And that belief, lost for centuries, was never truly gone. It was just waiting.
Chapter 8. Daily life in the Piraeus harbor, when the ship finally returned to the Piraeus. It was not greeted with celebration. No horns, no crowds, no speeches or garlands. It simply drifted into its slip, one of dozens, sliding between merchant vessels and other warships like a tired animal returning to its den. Haul the crates, refill the water, unfasten the ropes. The farmer moved automatically. His body knew what to do. He stepped down onto the dock, knees aching, and lifted a barrel. The sun was high. The city shimmered in the heat. Some walked with slaves trailing behind, carrying scrolls or parasols. They didn't look at the dock workers, didn't seem to hear the noise or smell the fish. Their Athens was not this one. Their city began at the hill, where the marble gleamed and the olive trees grew in neat lines. The harbor was only a throat, something their wealth passed through, never lingered in. The farmer sat quietly on his bench, hands resting on the oar. From stone jugs of water and shared bowls of lentils, from oars and benches and days measured in drumbeats, he had found a piece of canvas to lie on and a coil of rope to use as a pillow. The air was warm, the ground soft. The only sound was the wind in the trees. His legs ached. His hands curled even in sleep, as if still holding the oar. But his eyes closed easily. The noise of the harbor faded into something familiar. A lullaby of creaking beams, of distant laughter, of waves slapping against stone. He watched as the city's edge came into view, docks thick with ropes and crates, men moving in lines, sails snapping in the wind. 2 days before the ship would be stocked and sent out again, he had one small coin payment, if you could call it that. Enough for a piece of flatbread and a handful of olives. He chewed slowly as he walked, listening to the sellers shout their prices. The musicians pluck at lyres, the dogs barking at carts with hanging meat. A child bumped into him, eyes wide, holding a cluster of grapes. He said nothing, just smiled and ran. Some men used the time to find their families. Others spent it in taverns, drinking until the wine dulled their memories. A few wandered the city, staring at temples they had never entered. The farmer found a spot beside the water, beneath a stack of fishing nets, and sat with his feet in the sea. A woman sold figs in baskets woven from reeds. A boy offered roasted chickpeas in folded paper. The wind shifted the smell away. He closed his eyes. Around him, the harbor continued to move, ropes creaking, carts rolling, coins clinking, but none of it touched him for a while. He let the salt water lap at his ankles. Let the sun dry the sweat on his neck. Let the silence within him stretch out just long enough to feel like something real. The smell of garlic and vinegar drifted from a nearby tavern. For a moment, the farmer forgot the ship, thought of his wife's kitchen, the sound of oil sizzling in a clay pan, same one that lived in the farmer's arms. The rhythm of lifting, moving, lowering, rising with the sun, working until it set, and sleeping beside the tools you carried. A rhythm that didn't ask who you were, it's just what you could do. But then someone shoved past him with a crate, and the memory dissolved. Piraeus was not beautiful. It was useful. It was wide and gray and always moving. The harbor stretched like a mouth, opening into the sea, drawing in ships from all corners of the Aegean. Grain from Egypt, oil from the Cyclades, marble, wool, bronze, and men, always more men. Merchants with heavy bags, slaves with chained ankles, soldiers coming home with empty eyes. Rowers like him, stepping off the ship with nothing in their hands and everything in their backs. The ship docked with a soft bump. The crew was dismissed, not with thanks, but with orders. The docks smelled of fish and wood and sweat. Dozens of languages echoed between stone walls. The clatter of tools, the bray of animals, the bark of orders from shipmasters and quartermasters. Children ran barefoot between piles of rope, laughing until someone shouted them away. Dogs napped in the shade. Sailors argued over coin. Everything moved. Even when standing still, the harbor pulsed. The farmer walked past a row of market stalls set up just beyond the docks. Farther up the road, rich men moved differently. Their sandals were new, their tunics clean. Farmer didn't resent them. He just didn't think about them. His world was lower, narrower, built from wooden planks and thick rope. He was given a brief rest. It was a quiet corner, tucked between two stone sheds. Later that day, he walked through the market. Piraeus was not a place you came to find peace. But if you listened closely, you could find rhythm. The same rhythm that guided the ships. That night, the farmer slept in the corner of a storage shed. In dreams, he wasn't rowing. He was walking through a vineyard, maybe, or a quiet orchard. And then morning came. A knock on the shed door, an officer's voice. The ship was ready. The farmer stood, brushed off his tunic, walked back toward the water. The harbor was already awake, already loud. But beneath the noise, the rhythm remained. Pull, lift, row, return. And the ship waited.
The harbor was not just a place for ships. It was a city in miniature, a world folded into the space between water and stone. While soldiers marched and rowers drifted in and out with the tides. Another group of men and women lived here without leaving. He had always been part of a rhythm, but theirs moved differently. There was repetition here too, but of a gentler kind. A blacksmith hammering at the same post for hours, sparks flying into the sand. They did business with everyone, but belonged to no one. Their goods were varied: jars of oil, baskets of salt, carved combs, bits of ivory, copper bracelets, glass beads that glinted in the sun. Some had traveled farther than the farmer ever would. But the men selling them stood in the same place each day. He watched a group of boys chase a wooden hoop down a narrow lane. His stone moved slowly, round and round, each blade catching the light for a second before dulling again. The farmer nodded to him as he passed. The old man nodded back, never pausing, just spinning, sharpening, watching the metal change beneath his hand. They yelled and laughed, their voices rising over the clatter of carts. None wore sandals. One tripped, rolled, then jumped up laughing. Small flames and clay dishes, space between crates and beams. They didn't push back the dark. They just marked space within it. The farmer found a quiet spot near the storage yard and lay down again, this time with his tunic folded beneath his head. He watched the sky for a while, the stars unfamiliar. Everything felt farther away in Piraeus, even the heavens. For a moment, the farmer smiled, not because he knew them. He could hear laughter in the distance, someone playing a flute. And even though tomorrow would mean another voyage, another ship, another rhythm of pull and pain and salt, for tonight he was part of something else. But because he had once watched his son do the same thing, knees scratched, eyes wide, laughter like water on stone, that was years ago now, or maybe just months. It was hard to say. Their faces were shaded, not by helmets, but by woven straw. Their voices, calm and practiced. If they feared war, they didn't show it. If they thought of the sea, they didn't speak of it. A woman at a loom, thread passed through wooden arms, the sound of clack and pull as steady as breath. The farmer passed by as a young man carved lines into the side of a large bowl, each stroke deliberate. They watched the dock workers with folded arms, their sandals clean, their posture unbent. They rarely spoke to the rowers. They saw them arrive, dirty and exhausted, and knew they would be gone again soon. No reason to learn names, no need to ask questions. The rowers passed like weather, temporary, harsh, necessary. A child sat nearby, watching, mimicking the motion in the dust with a stick. This too is rhythm, not the harsh beat of a drum, but the slow unfolding of skill passed from hand to hand. These men worked in circles, building from the center out, shaping vessels meant to last, until they cracked, were dropped, were forgotten. Not unlike ships. A boy running from the grain mill, his hands covered in white dust, his feet quick and sure over cobbled stone. These people were not free, not exactly, but they belonged to the land. Their roots ran deep into the dust and stone of Athens. They wouldn't be pulled away tomorrow or next week or by the next fleet order. Their lives didn't rise and fall with the war. Their worries were closer, quieter, and just as heavy. The blacksmith, the potter, the baker, the child who cleaned out stables. Their days began before the sun touched the mast tops and ended long after the last sail had been tied down. The farmer, in his brief time ashore, watched them. They had homes. Not large ones, not rich, but homes, walls that held warmth, roofs that stayed still, doors that opened to familiar voices. The farmer had a home once, a small one near a stream, a flat rock where his son used to drop pebbles and laugh at the splash. It felt far away now. Sometimes he wondered if he'd even find it again. If the path still ran straight, or if the stream had dried and the house had caved in. He didn't know, and the not knowing was worse than the loss. The fishermen worked closest to the water. Their boats were smaller one sail, no drums, no bronze-tipped rams. Just nets, worn hands, and the trust that the sea would give something back. They spoke little, even among themselves. They mended nets with bone needles, patched sails with strips of cloth, and watched the tide like it was an old friend with strange moods. The farmer saw one of them once, kneeling on the dock, his head bowed, a line of small fish laid out in front of him. It wasn't prayer, it was gratitude. Farther back from the water, merchants paced in front of stalls, counting coins, weighing fruit, nodding to passing soldiers with a kind of polite indifference. The potter's yard was loud with scraping and turning. Wheel against foot, clay against hand, water splashing gently in shallow basins. The city guards strolled between stalls, their armor more decorative than protective. One afternoon, the farmer sat at the edge of a stone wall, eating a bit of fig paste wrapped in dry bread. In the shade nearby, an old man sharpened knives. Not for war, for kitchens, for butchers. That night, the harbor lights flickered along the water's edge, but the ground was dry. The air was still. Not a soldier, not a citizen. Just another man passing through a city that never stopped moving. And under the hum of torches and carts, markets and sales, he closed his eyes. Chapter 9. Symposium with an Athenian General Segment 1. The room was quiet, save for the soft clink of pottery and the low murmur of voices. Oil lamps flickered along the walls, casting golden shapes across painted murals, images of gods reclining on clouds. Warriors frozen mid-charge, horses with wings and chariots in flame. It was a private room somewhere in the hills above Piraeus, hidden from the smell of fish, from the shouting at the docks, from the sea itself. Here the air smelled of pressed olives, roasted lamb, and sweet wine. Here, time moved differently. The general reclined on a couch made of dark wood, the cushion beneath him thick and covered in dyed fabric. He held a cup in his hand, not like a sailor gripping for balance, but lightly, as if the wine might float out on its own. Around him, other men sat or lounged, some barefoot, some in sandals too clean to have touched real dust. Their robes were soft, their beards trimmed, their fingers bore rings. The symposium was not a banquet. It was quieter, slower. A gathering for conversation, not feasting. Food came first, meats and olives, cheese wrapped in vine leaves, honeyed nuts in clay bowls. Then came wine, mixed with water in a broad vessel and ladled into cups. Drinking too fast was frowned upon. This was about savoring, about appearing measured, about listening as much as speaking. A flute played somewhere near the door. The music was light, trailing in and out of earshot like a memory. And as the wine began to settle in the blood, the talk began to rise. They spoke of war, of course they did. The general leaned forward, his voice calm but rich with detail. He described the coastline of Salamis, the way the Persian ships had crowded themselves into the strait. He spoke of the maneuver, how he had angled his ships just so, baiting the enemy forward. He tapped two fingers against his knee as he spoke, illustrating the turn, the trap, the moment when chaos became victory. The others listened, some nodding, some asking questions. They were not soldiers, not most of them. They were thinkers, advisors, landowners, men with influence, men whose sons would one day hold command but had never held an oar. None of them asked about the rowers. None of them asked how many died, or how many didn't come back. That part was understood, but not spoken aloud. In this room, war was strategy, shape, outcome. Victory was the point. Sacrifice was assumed. The general wasn't cruel. He didn't sneer. But his words moved like tools sharp, smooth, clean. The war to him was a problem to be solved. The men who solved it were parts of the solution. Some were leaders, some were shields, some were muscle. He had once been young, he said. He had stood on the deck of a trireme, watched the sun rise over the mast. He had felt fear once, long ago. He said this with a small smile, a flick of the wrist, as if fear were an old cloak he had long since outgrown. Now he feared mistakes, not arrows, bad decisions, not blades. He lifted his cup, drank, continued. One man across the room asked about the next campaign. Would they push east? Would they hold the islands? The general gave a careful answer. Not too confident, not too hesitant, just enough certainty to inspire, just enough mystery to keep control. The farmer wasn't there, of course. He would never be invited to such a room. But the things said there still reached him, in decisions passed down through officers, in orders pinned to masts, in extra rowing shifts, in fewer rations, in routes altered at the last moment. The farmer lived the consequence of every conversation held in rooms like this, and yet his name would never be spoken in them. Back in the symposium, the talk shifted. Someone recited a poem, something about ships and sirens. Another quoted a philosopher, his voice slow and deliberate, letting each word float like incense. They debated the soul, the nature of courage, whether glory could exist without recognition. They used words like virtue and balance and honor. The general nodded at the right moments, smiled at the right turns of phrase. Outside, the night deepened. The lamps burned lower. The cups emptied and were refilled. The flute player stopped and was replaced by silence, save for the soft rustle of robes and the occasional yawn. The general stood and stretched. He wasn't old, but his back moved slowly. He looked out a narrow window toward the sea, its dark surface just visible in the moonlight. He said something about the city, how it had to be defended from within, not just from beyond. How order and discipline at home were as important as courage abroad. Heads nodded. A servant brought a fresh jug of wine. At no point did anyone mention the deckhands who loaded the crates, the boy who swept the floor after they left, the cook who had prepared the meal, the men who had rowed the general's ship into battle and would do so again tomorrow. Those men didn't belong in the story being told here. Their pain was too heavy, their sweat too real. They didn't fit the symmetry of the general's words, and yet they were there, just outside, in the muscles that held the city upright, in the rhythm that moved its ships, in the quiet cost that none of the polished voices dared to speak aloud. As the night deepened, the voices in the symposium grew slower, more reflective. The wine had dulled the sharp edges of debate. Even the most passionate speakers leaned farther into their cushions now, their gestures looser, their thoughts trailing off into soft laughter. But his voice, when he spoke, remained steady. The question was simple, but it changed the room. The conversation paused. A few men turned their heads. The general smiled faintly. He carried the room not by force, but by weight. When he leaned forward, others listened. When he paused, others waited. He did not command ships with his strength. He commanded men with his certainty. Outside, the harbor was silent. Only the faint lapping of water remained, slow, deliberate. These men had heard these words before, from their fathers, from their tutors, from the city itself, but still, they liked hearing them again. They liked being reminded of their role at the top of something stable. The general still sat near the center, one leg stretched, the other bent beneath him. His cup had been filled and emptied several times. If the beam breaks, what then? A complex craft, gliding forward only if every part worked together. The philosophers provided thought. The lawmakers shaped structure. The soldiers enforced peace. The rowers provided force. Without them, he said, nothing moves. But without us, nothing is guided. One of the younger guests asked him what made a good leader. A good leader, he said, is the one who understands the cost, but does not tremble before it. That to lead was to deserve, not simply to command. That those born into comfort were not just lucky, they were necessary. Because someone, they insisted, had to know what direction to steer. He washed without speaking, then dried them on a cloth finer than anything a rower would wear in his lifetime. When he turned back to the room, his voice was calm. He said that a city like Athens could not thrive without hierarchy. No one asked what happened to the parts that could not be replaced. He moved with quiet purpose, a man with duties to return to, a man with lives to manage, fleets to coordinate, battles to plan. As he passed into the courtyard, he paused for a moment, looking up at the stars. No one wondered aloud how many men were thrown overboard in the name of stability. He didn't consider whether the food rations were sufficient. He thought only of the next engagement, the alignment of forces, the movement of ships without structure, without men willing to follow. Not everyone, he said, was meant to decide. Not everyone was meant to lead. Some were born to listen. An order came from men who did not ask why. A place where nothing pulled at the oar, where no drum beat, where the only sound was wind in the trees. On hands calloused before the sun has risen, that is why we must not flinch. Of the hands that would soon grip the oars again. Of the men who would row through another storm so that this room could remain untouched. Not in the courts. Not in the councils. Not in the face of sacrifice. Even when it arrived home, it was managed in ledger books and council debates. The ones who truly suffered were always somewhere else. At sea, in the barracks, below deck. Others to build. Still others to row. They discussed drama and music, and which sculptor's new work best captured the soul of a god. They quoted Euripides. They argued about taxes. They returned to familiar ground, and all of them had a place, just as a ship had beams, ropes, and sails, each one necessary, none the same. No one interrupted. He spoke of order, of the need for discipline. There were nods around the room. One man, a merchant's son with too much wine in his cup, offered a question, and if the oarsman refuses to row? The general didn't hesitate. Then the ship must replace it. Quickly, or it sinks. Laughter followed, but not the general's. He wasn't joking. He went on to describe the city as a vessel. There it was. The truth beneath the words, that the weight of power rested on the belief that it was justified. No one in the room asked what it felt like to be the one doing the rowing. Because in rooms like this, suffering was abstract. War was distant. The general stood again and walked slowly to a basin where a servant poured water over his hands. Athens is fragile, he said. Its greatness rests on choices made before the rest of the world wakes up. He didn't say whose hands bore the calluses. He didn't need to. The men in the room nodded. They refilled their cups. They spoke again of politics, of property disputes, of the merits of Spartan discipline versus Athenian freedom. But beneath it all unspoken was the steady presence of the sea, of the ship waiting in the harbor, the general left before the others. He didn't wonder if the rowers were sleeping well, because in his world, peace came from strength. Strength came from order. That night, the farmer dreamed again of water. But this time it was still a lake out to sea. But when he woke, he heard the footsteps of officers in the dirt outside. And he knew the ship would sail again. Chapter 10. Democracy, but not for you. The sun rose slowly over Athens, washing the city in a warm golden light that softened its marble temples and filled the narrow streets with long shadows. From the Knicks The hill where the assembly met, the sea was just visible in the distance. Ships in the harbor looked like toys. Rowers were invisible from here. Men gathered at the Nix early. Citizens, voters, free Athenian males over the age of 20. Those who had completed their military training. They carried their cloaks, sometimes a staff, sometimes a piece of bread in one hand and a voice in the other. There was a kind of pride in showing up early, in standing with others and debating the affairs of the city. They would vote on war, on taxes, on alliances. They would listen to speeches, raise their hands, argue. But not everyone could come. Not everyone was allowed. The farmer turned rower, if he ever came to the Nix, came only to sweep its steps before dawn. He was not a citizen. His parents had not been citizens. His birth did not grant him the right to speak or vote. His hands could bleed for Athens, but his words carried no weight. His silence was part of the system. Democracy in Athens was real, but it was bounded. It existed within walls that kept many out. Women, slaves, foreigners, even poor men born within the city. Limits could find themselves voiceless if they lacked the proper lineage or land. The idea was noble rule by the people, but the definition of people was narrow. The assembly met roughly every 10 days. Citizens gathered in the open air, seated on stone benches carved into the slope. There were no microphones, no amplifiers. Just voices, loud, clear, trained to carry. Some men practiced for days before speaking. Others had the gift of rhetoric, able to twist words like rope, binding their listeners to their will. The rowers heard about these speeches secondhand. Officers repeated the outcomes. Orders trickled down. Taxes were adjusted. New fleets approved. But the reasons, the debates, the language that shaped their lives, those were kept at a distance. Like the taste of a feast smelled from behind a wall. Sometimes a rower would ask why. Why this route? Why this attack? Why these rations? The answer was often the same. It was decided in the assembly by the citizens. As if that explained everything. The courts worked much the same way. Juries were large, sometimes hundreds of men, chosen by lot. They judged not only criminals but matters of state. Trials could last hours, days. Litigants delivered long rehearsed speeches. Witnesses were brought forward. The jurors voted with small discs, one marked, one blank, slipped into a clay urn. Justice, like voting, belonged to those within the circle. If you were a citizen, you could bring a charge. If you were not, you had to hope someone would speak for you. Often, no one did. The city prided itself on freedom. And in many ways, it had more than most. Men could criticize leaders openly. They could propose new laws. They could vote against war even while their sons served in it. But this freedom had a border. And beyond that border were the ones who built the ships, rowed them, fought with spear and shield, and returned to nothing. The general, the one from the symposium, had the right to speak at any time. His name carried weight. His voice could sway decisions. His experience gave him authority. But the farmer, the man who pulled the oar in that general's ship, would never be called to the platform. His experience didn't translate. His voice would be lost in the wind. There was a ritual each time the assembly met. A herald would step forward and ask if anyone wished to bring charges against those who failed the city. This was meant to keep leaders accountable, to ensure that power did not rot in silence. But only citizens could answer that call. A rower could be starved, beaten, sent to die in a war he never supported, and he would have no place in that ritual. No voice to raise, no question to ask, and yet the system held, partly through fear, partly through belief. The rowers believed in Athens, not because it served them equally, but because it was theirs in spirit, if not in law. They fought not just for democracy, but for the hope that one day their children might belong to it more fully than they ever could. They believed in the city's promise, even when it excluded them. They watched the marble gleam in the sun and imagined a future where their voices might carry beyond the docks, beyond the benches, beyond the oars, but not yet. He arrived in Athens just after sunrise, walking the dusty road from Piraeus with his hands stuffed into his cloak. It was not his first time in the city, but it was the first time he had come on a day the assembly met. He didn't plan to attend, of course. He couldn't, but something had drawn him toward the hill where it all happened. Not curiosity. Exactly. Something quieter. A need to see. His name wasn't written in his citizen registry. His family didn't own land. His birth had taken place in a shack 2 fields from the sea, but he had rowed for Athens. He had bled into its benches. He had watched its banners flutter over burning ships. He had shouted the city's name with salt in his mouth and fire on his breath. He thought that maybe he had earned the right to watch. The next wasn't grand. It was a slope carved with rows of benches, open to the sky. The bema, a flat stone platform, rose near the front. From there, men spoke. They stood tall, hands raised, words aimed like arrows across the crowd. Their voices rolled down the hill, smooth and trained. Every speaker had a rhythm. A rise and fall, a pause, just long enough to seem wise. The rower found a place beneath a fig tree at the edge of the gathering, far enough not to be noticed, but close enough to hear. His tunic was damp from the walk. His hands still bore the blisters of his last voyage. He didn't speak. He just watched. The first speaker talked about silver, about the mines in Lorien and the theft of profits. He accused the magistrate of corruption. The crowd murmured. A second speaker countered. He defended the accused with charts and coin counts. He wore a robe without a stain. His voice never cracked. Next came a man arguing for war. He pointed east with his whole arm. He spoke of threats, of honor, of enemies growing bold. He named islands the rower had never heard of. The assembly listened. Some men nodded. Others scratched their beards. The rower stared at the speaker's feet. Clean, sandals that had never touched brine or blood. He thought of the men who would be chosen to fight, chosen not by vote, but by command. Men who would pack their gear, say goodbye, and march toward a place they didn't choose for a reason they didn't decide. He looked around. The benches were filled with men who would never pick up a shield again. Their battles were words now, their weapons speech. They could shape the fate of hundreds with the lift of a hand. At midday, the assembly paused. Some men stretched. Others argued in small groups. A boy passed out dates wrapped in leaves. The rower stood and walked slowly around the perimeter. No one stopped him. No one saw him. He was a shadow in a city of voices. Near the edge of the hill, he spotted a familiar face. One of the ship's officers. A younger man, well-fed, born to a family of craftsmen. A citizen. He was speaking with 2 others, gesturing with his hands, laughing. The rower hesitated. He almost approached. Almost said something. But he didn't. He turned and walked the other way. Whatever words he had thought of felt too small now, too fragile in the weight of his place. In a shaded corner, he found a small fountain. The water was warm from the sun, but he drank anyway. A boy sat nearby, carving a pattern into a piece of wood with a dull blade. The rower asked what he was making. A whistle, the boy said without looking up. The rower nodded. For who? No one, said the boy. Just making. The boy's fingers moved with quiet skill. It reminded the rower of carving oars, of smoothing wood with nothing but a shell and patience, of building tools no one would admire, no one would praise, but everyone would use. He sat beside the boy for a while, not speaking, just listening to the scratch of wood, and the far-off voices of men who believed the city was theirs alone. Later, as the sun began to dip, the assembly began to close. A final vote. Hands raised, discs dropped, decisions made. The rower didn't stay to hear the outcome. He stood, dusted off his tunic, and began the walk back toward the harbor. The road curved down through olive groves, past fields gone fallow, past homes with tiled roofs and windows that faced the sea. He didn't feel angry. Not exactly. More hollow. Like something had been confirmed. He had seen the city's heart, and it did not beat for him. That night, as he lay on the dock beside his ship, he stared up at the stars. The same stars the assembly men had seen from the hill. The same stars that had watched ships rise and fall, empires fade, names forgotten. He whispered one question to the sky, not expecting an answer. How can a city love a man who it will not hear? The sea gave no reply. Only the slow slap of water against wood. Chapter 11. Education and elite naval training. He was 12 and already clever. He could quote Homer from memory, recite the names of Athenian heroes, and sketch a simple map of the islands around the city. His father said he was born for command. His mother called him a lion among sheep. Olive trees grew nearby, their silver green leaves whispering when the breeze passed. A servant brought bread and goat cheese on a small tray. Another poured watered wine into a painted cup. Tutors came every morning, their robes clean, their sandals polished. They carried scrolls and soft-voiced discipline, not for performance, but for discipline, to train the mind to listen. Then came arithmetic, pebbles arranged into lines, questions about quantity and value. How many rations to supply 50 men for a week? How to divide spoils, how to calculate wind and distance. The boy studied in a courtyard filled with sunlight. Birds nested in the columns. Questions floated on the air, not demanding answers, but inviting thought. He knew how to tell when a merchant was lying. He could throw a stone hard enough to drop a bird mid-flight. Not because he wanted to, but because sometimes there wasn't food. Never tasted seawater. Never slipped on a slick deck. But he knew how to angle a ram, when to feint, when to chase. His games at night were played with carved ships, moving across the marble floor while he imagined enemy fleets burning under his command. His tutor encouraged pause. To speak slowly was to think deeply. He would be dressed in clean linen, given a cabin, handed a schedule. He would be taught how to issue orders, how to read wind from the sail's curve, how to listen to the beat of the rowing drum and match it to the pace of war. Even silence, if purposeful, was a kind of wisdom. He would be told when to eat, when to sleep, when to row. No one would ask if he could read. No one would care if he couldn't. He would speak of courage, of timing, of strategy. Or limping down the street, his knee ruined by years of bracing for the waves. If he told his story, few would listen, and none would write it down. He would mention the strength of the crew, but not their names. Might issue commands he didn't understand. Might report discipline problems from the lower men without using names. A flanking maneuver. The tutor used small wooden models to show movement, collisions, retreat. You became part of the ship one plank among many, and if you died, you were replaced with another boy who had never seen a wax tablet or tasted wine from a silver cup. The boy asked questions, clever ones, and his tutor smiled. Yes, he had a mind for war. His father was dead. His mother worked in the dye market. The boy didn't go to school. He carried water in cracked pots. He helped haul fish from carts. One existed in the world the other could never reach, and both knew it. He learned by watching, by guessing, by being told to move faster. It turned boys into citizens, then into leaders. It was a slow process, polished by time and money, and it was almost entirely closed to the poor. He began with music, a lyre, its strings soft under his fingers. Later, philosophy. What is justice? What is honor? But his favorite lessons came in the afternoon. Naval tactics. He listened as diagrams were drawn on wax tablets. 3 ships here, 5 there. The crescent formation. He had never smelled a ship. Down in the poorer quarter, another boy the same age walked barefoot across broken stone. He had never seen a wax tablet, never heard the word philosophy. But he knew how to run through a crowded street without tripping. One boy was trained to rule, the other to survive. And one day, both would serve on the same ship. When the time came, the first boy would be assigned as a junior officer, giving command over a small unit, expected to watch and learn. The second boy would be taken below deck. No schedule, no explanation. Just the oar, just the seat, just the rhythm. Their paths, once separate, now crossed in silence. The officer might pass him on the deck and never look twice. The rower would see the officer's shoes polished and dry and wonder what it felt like to walk without watching your step. Neither hated the other. That was the odd part. Hatred took energy. This was something softer, a quiet mutual absence. In Athens, education was the armor of the powerful. It allowed them to navigate courts, command troops, argue with words instead of weapons. To row was not a career, it was a sentence. You aged faster below deck, your back bent, your hands hardened. The officer, years later, might stand before the assembly and describe a battle he'd led. The rower might be dead by then, or selling charcoal in the market. In the city of wisdom, not all minds were fed, and the silence of those below was the foundation for the speeches above. He boarded the ship just after dawn, still adjusting the sash on his tunic, trying to remember everything his tutors had said. Stand tall, speak clearly, make eye contact, lead with your posture. The other officers had greeted him with short nods. A cot, a basin, a hook for his cloak. The captain approached, an older man with a crooked nose and a scar on his wrist. His voice was low but firm. The walls smelled faintly of tar and salt. The deck above creaked softly as the crew moved. Below him, he could hear the muted shuffling of rowers settling in. He pictured them like his diagrams rows and rows, all facing backward, moving forward by pushing behind. It was a strange metaphor for life, but no one in Athens questioned it. A few of them looked only slightly older than him, but their eyes carried something heavier. Fewer questions, less shine. Rowers leaned into it, their backs bending like reeds, their arms moving in silent harmony. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They knew the rhythm better than their own names. To understand the lives beneath him. His boots echoed on the steps. Legs braced, eyes forward, muscles taut. The beat of the drum matched their hearts. He watched for a minute, maybe 2. Not a challenge, not fear, just a look that asked a quiet question. The heat hit him first, then the smell salt, sweat, wood, and something else, something human and old. The space was low. The ceiling pressed down. The air on deck felt cold after that, the sun too bright, his tunic too clean. He ducked instinctively, even though he was not tall. He was shown to his quarters, small but private. He stepped onto the deck with a leather scroll case slung over one shoulder and a quiet confidence he hoped looked natural. Not a fierce one. Just enough wind and chop to make the deck slippery and the horizon blur. The officer tried to keep his footing. He repeated orders he had memorized, but his voice cracked. One man adjusted his pace to compensate for the swell, setting the rhythm a fraction slower so the others wouldn't strain. No one told him to. It just happened. That's how it worked below. Quiet decisions. Shared knowledge. Motion without instruction. He forgot to brace when the ship rolled. He fell once, caught himself on a crate. No one laughed. That was somehow worse. You speak. They listen. You direct. They move. But here, surrounded by creaking wood and sky, everything felt uncertain. The ship was a living thing. It groaned. It shuddered. It tested you. You trained with wax and wood. Let's see how you do with water. There's no malice in it, just reality. The officer nodded, unsure of what to say. He turned toward the stern and watched as sailors untied the ropes, as the sails were trimmed and the ship eased away from the dock. He was another part of the ship, a new part, unproven. It would happen here, in silence, in the way he moved, in how he looked at the men below, in how long he took to speak, in whether he stayed calm when the sea rose again. The harbor slipped behind them. The city rose like a painting, white stone and red roofs glowing in the morning light. The sea widened. Below deck, the drum began, a slow, deep beat. The officer climbed down once, just once. He wanted to see them. He had written speeches in his head for this moment. Lines about loyalty, unity, Athens. But none of them seemed right now. None of them matched the rhythm of the sea. They didn't look up. 40 men to a side. Bare backs. Shaved heads. One rower noticed him. Didn't stop rowing. Just turned his head slightly. What are you doing down here? The officer said nothing. Didn't he know how to speak to men who had rowed longer than he lived? So he turned and climbed back up. In his lessons, he had imagined command as clarity. On the second day, a storm rolled in. Below deck, the rowers didn't miss a beat. They moved as if the storm didn't exist. Their bodies knew the sea in ways he never could. The officer watched from above, damp and shivering, and realized something else his tutors hadn't said. Authority was not respect. It had to be earned. Later, when the storm passed, the captain approached him with a half smile. He didn't vomit. That's something. The officer tried to smile back. Failed. He looked toward the horizon. How do you know when they're listening to you? He asked. The captain shrugged. When you stop talking and they still follow. That night, the officer sat alone near the stern, listening to the gentle slap of water and the occasional mutter from the men on deck. He thought of the boy from his courtyard, carving little ships, talking of tactics, all theory, all imagination. This was different. Here, if you got it wrong, men died. He slept little, just dozed between shifts, his body sore from bracing against the ship's movement. No one treated him cruelly, but no one deferred either. And he understood now that proving himself would not happen in the assembly or the symposium. And maybe, if he lasted long enough, one of those rowers might look at him again, not with that quiet question, but with the flicker of something close to trust, but not yet. Chapter 12, Mutiny, Punishment, and Discipline. There is a particular sound a warship makes when everything is in sync. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's just the soft rhythmic creak of oars dipping and pulling in perfect time, like breathing. Like a heart. When that rhythm breaks, even slightly, the entire ship notices. Discipline on a trireme wasn't enforced by cruelty alone. It was built into the wood, into the rope, into the very structure of the vessel. There wasn't space to hide. There wasn't time to debate. If one man fell out of rhythm, he risked pulling the man behind him, and that man pulled another. And suddenly the ship staggered in the water like a drunk on uneven ground. So they punished, quietly, precisely, without ceremony. Most errors weren't met with shouts. They were met with glances. The rower beside you might mutter a word or a name. A warning. Make it right. Stay in line. The rhythm was everything. And When that failed, the officer noticed. He didn't scream. He didn't rant. He tapped his staff once against the beam, and a petty commander moved toward the source of the mistake. Sometimes it was a tap on the shoulder. Sometimes it was a few words through clenched teeth. And if the rower didn't respond, if he argued, if he pushed back, then came the real correction. They used leather cords, not thick ones. Thin enough to sting, to welt, but not to break bone. One across the back, maybe two. Not as spectacle. Just as instruction. The ship didn't stop. The drum didn't pause. The others didn't turn. The punishment was given mid-row, and then it passed. But it wasn't the lash that truly kept order. It was shame. A man who disrupted the flow was a threat to the ship, a weak link, a burden. And when you shared a bench with 30 others, when your sweat mixed with theirs, and your breath matched theirs, you did not want to be the reason they failed. Disgrace spread faster than pain. There were worse offenses. Speaking back to an officer, sleeping on duty, hoarding rations. These were not just mistakes. These were breaches of trust. And trust, aboard a ship built to be faster, tighter, and leaner than its enemy, was everything. In rare cases, mutiny occurred. Not the kind sung about in later stories. Not swords drawn or flags raised. More like a quiet refusal. A group of rowers not moving at the drum's beat. A sudden silence below deck. Eyes locked on a commander who had lost their respect. When that happened, the officers met privately. A decision was made quickly. One man might be pulled aside. Removed, beaten, replaced. Not publicly. Not as theater. Just enough to break the silence and remind the rest where command lived. Athens couldn't afford dramatic spectacles on its warships. These were machines of speed and timing, not platforms for rebellion. The real punishment came later when the ship docked. The accused would be summoned, tried, not before soldiers, but before citizens. A naval court, witnesses, oaths, statements read aloud. If found guilty, punishments ranged widely. Fines, stripping of rank, public shaming, exile, in rare cases, death. But even the threat of trial was often enough. Reputation in Athens was currency. A man seen as disloyal or unstable could lose his future. His children might be denied apprenticeships. His name whispered in disapproval at the Agora. For many, that was worse than any lash. Still, not all discipline came from above. Rowers governed each other. They knew who was lazy, who skipped effort during the long rows, who faked illness to avoid duty. And they had their own justice, a cold stare, a refused favor, a shared silence that pressed harder than any punishment. You could row among them and still be alone. One man, they said, once stole a ration meant for a sick rower. Just a lump of barley. Just once. He wasn't beaten. He wasn't reported, but no one spoke to him for the rest of the journey. No one passed him water. No one nodded when he limped to his bench. He left the ship at the next port and never returned. That was the sentence. To be erased. Discipline was a current beneath the surface. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The rhythm of the ship trained the men better than any speech. And the fear of standing alone, of being the crack in the hull, kept them tighter than chains. Above deck, officers wrote reports. Below deck, the rowers watched one another. And that quiet pressure, that constant gaze was what truly held the warship together. He had been quiet all morning. The boy at the end of the third bench, closest to the prow, barely 16, maybe younger, though no one had asked. He rowed like he was trying not to be noticed. His strokes shallow, his breathing soft, his gaze always downward. No one knew his name. New recruits were common. They came and went, and most kept to themselves until they earned a rhythm. But this one had looked pale from the start, not seasick, not scared, just hollow. Like something had already been taken from him before the ship even left port. The officers hadn't noticed. The drumbeat carried through the belly of the ship like a slow heartbeat. Boom, boom, pull, boom, boom, boo. Or if they had, they didn't speak of it. It wasn't their job to coddle. If he could lift the oar and keep time with the drum, that was enough. His head bounced lightly against the bench in front of him. For a second, no one moved. Everyone kept rowing. And that was the rule. Unless commanded otherwise, the rhythm never stopped. It was mid-morning when it happened. The sun was already hot above deck. The sea calmed the horizon steady. Then a break. A soft thud, barely audible over the others. His oar clattered. His body slumped forward. He reached out, steadied the oar before it could swing into someone else. The boy was pulled gently to the side, laid across a woven mat near the storage crates. His chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. His skin pale, mouth cracked. Someone passed a damp cloth. Someone else tilted a water skin toward his lips. He crouched beside the boy, pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Then he looked up. Not panicked. The boy was awake now, eyes dull, still weak. He hadn't spoken. He looked at the boy. No movement, no sound. Just sweat on his forehead and the loose angle of his arm. But his benchmate turned. An older man, scar on his jaw, hands like worn rope. He's out, the man said. Calm. The commander moved quickly, stepping over beams and between backs. Keep pace. The older man didn't move. He hasn't drunk water since morning. Inside, a piece of fig and a bit of cheese. Old, but still good. That's not your concern. It is if he dies and we keep rowing like he's furniture. You didn't admit weakness, and you didn't flaunt kindness. A ship wasn't a machine of identical parts. It was a living thing made of different men with different breaking points. But some rules were older than any naval code, like helping a man who couldn't stand or sharing when someone had nothing. They had seen him collapse. They had seen him rise. That was enough. He simply made a note in the log and turned away. A pause. In another army, this might have been defiance. Here, it was a question, a challenge dressed in courtesy. The commander's face didn't change. He stood, drag him back, put someone in his place. If he wakes, he'll row. Another showed him how to wrap his fingers to prevent blisters. He didn't smile, but he nodded. That was something. They obeyed. They always did. The ship kept moving. Later, when the sun dipped and shadows stretched long across the deck, the commander returned. You'll row tomorrow, the commander said. The boy nodded. No apology. No protest. After he left, the older man sat beside him. You'll need to eat tonight. Real food. Not just the barley mush. The boy blinked slowly. I don't have any. The man looked away, pretended not to hear that. He reached into his own pack and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Eat half. Save the rest. The boy hesitated, then took it. It was a quiet kind of mercy, the kind not spoken of later. The next morning, the boy was back on the bench. He rowed slower than before, but he rowed. The others adjusted around him, just slightly. No one mentioned it. No one needed to. The commander watched from above. He didn't punish the older man. Didn't thank him either. Discipline, on the surface, was about rules, but beneath it was understanding. Too much leniency, and it fell apart. Too much cruelty, and it snapped. The real skill was balance. Knowing when to strike, when to speak, when to step aside and let silence do the work. By evening, the boy was no longer invisible. A man passed him a cup of water without being asked. Discipline had done its job, but It wasn't the lash that brought him back to the bench. It was the men beside him. Chapter 30. Death at Sea and Forgotten Graves. The sea does not mark graves. It does not gather stones. It does not carry memory the way the earth does. In a city, a dead man is buried. A name is carved. A family visits. But on the open water, there is no ceremony. There is only the quiet moment after a man falls, and then the choice of what to do with what's left of him. They say you can smell death before you see it, even at sea. It's not the scent itself, but a change in the air, a heaviness, a silence that doesn't belong. On board a trireme, death didn't come with drama. It came slowly, almost politely. A cough that didn't fade, a wound that never healed. A slip on the deck, the back of the head striking the beam just wrong. There were no doctors on board, just rags, vinegar, and guesses. When a man died below deck, the rowers didn't stop. The drum kept its beat. The others kept moving. A body could be carried off the bench, laid beneath a sail, covered if possible. There wasn't space for mourning. There wasn't time. The sea didn't wait, and neither did Athens. If the ship was near port, they might bring him ashore, burn him quietly, scatter his ashes or bury them in borrowed ground. But if they were too far out, if the wind was good and the schedule tight, then they did what every worship did. They gave him to the sea. There was no speech, no incense. Just two men gripping the body beneath the arms and ankles, standing by the railing. Maybe someone muttered a name. Maybe someone crossed themselves or whispered a prayer to Poseidon. But usually they didn't. The splash was quiet. The sea closed over him, and that was it. No one spoke of it later, not because they didn't care, but because it happened often, too often to give each death the weight it might deserve. Grief was a luxury not afforded in motion. A name would be scratched out from the roster, rations adjusted, a new man added at the next stop. Life aboard the ship continued, as if it hadn't just lost a part of itself. But it stayed in the minds of the others, not as sadness necessarily, but as caution. The sea took who it wanted. Illness, storm, battle, hunger. You could be young and strong and still vanish between waves. In Athens, families lit lamps for the dead. They left offerings. They sang hymns. But for men who died at sea, there was no homecoming. Their spirits, some believed, wandered, restless, searching for the earth that never held them. A mother might stand at the port, scanning the horizon, waiting for a ship that would never return. She'd ask the harbor master, then the priests, then anyone who might know. Some would lie kindly, some would say nothing. Eventually, someone would shrug and say the ship made it, but not everyone aboard did. And she would know. There were no cenotaphs for rowers, no marble statues for deckhands. Maybe their name was mentioned once in the Agora by a neighbor. Maybe a brother told a story over wine. But then the memory faded, replaced by new names, new wars, new storms. Some officers received memorials. Their families paid for them. They were buried with honors if their body returned. If not, a shrine was raised in their absence. But for the ordinary men, the ones who bled and pulled and died beside each other, the sea was the only witness. In the quiet of the night, when the ship rocked gently and most were asleep, some rowers spoke of it, not loudly, not often. But in whispers, they shared stories of men lost, how they died, what they said in their final moments, whether they cried out, whether they looked peaceful. These stories passed between hammocks and oars like soft-spoken ghosts. It was their way of keeping them alive, if only for a little while longer. One man, they said, died smiling. No one knew why. He hadn't been well. He coughed for days. But when he went, he did so quietly, as if he'd seen something gentle beyond the pain. Another fell from the deck during a storm and was never seen again. His benchmates stared at the waves for hours afterward, as if waiting for a hand to rise from below. The hardest deaths were the ones that didn't come quickly, the ones that took days, fevers, infections. Men who once sang, now silent, curled beneath damp blankets, shivering even in the sun. There was nothing to be done, no way to fix it. You offered water, you stayed close, and when the end came, you said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and yet they kept rowing. Not because they were heartless, but because the ship depended on them. If you stopped, the others had to work harder. If you cried, you risked losing pace. Grief was private, internal, save for dry land, if it ever came. Sometimes a man would carve a mark into the wood by his bench. Just a line, nothing more. No one asked what it meant. But over time, a few benches bore many lines. They remembered. Even if the world did not, when a ship returned to port, the docks filled quickly. Wives, sons, old fathers with bent backs, younger sisters clinging to wool cloaks. They all gathered along the stone paths and wooden planks, eyes trained on the faces aboard, counting silently, looking for one in particular. The lucky ones spotted a familiar figure, thinner perhaps, sunburned, changed but walking, alive. For others, the recognition never came. Just a slow unraveling as the reality settled in. He was not there. There were no official announcements, no roster of the dead posted on city walls. News traveled quietly, man to man. An officer might approach a waiting mother, his face hard, his voice low. He fell overboard. He grew sick. We did not recover him. That was often all. No explanation, no comfort. Just a few words and a look that told her everything had already been said. Out on the water, where she could never go. For those left behind, the morning looked different. Without a body, they could not perform the traditional burial rites. No coins for Karen. No washing of the limbs. No wrapping in fine linen or oils. No placing of sacred herbs beneath the tongue. Instead, families improvised. They built symbolic altars, small and personal, a sandal, a piece of cloth. Sometimes a carved nameplate rested against a simple oil lamp that burned each night for weeks or even months. But even these gestures felt incomplete. Athenians believed that an unburied soul wandered, that without proper rites the spirit could not rest. It drifted just out of reach, watching but unable to cross. This fear settled deep in the bones of the city. It haunted dreams and songs. Poets wrote of it, dramatists turned it into cautionary tales, but for the common families of rowers, it was not poetry. It was absence. A son who would never come through the doorway, a husband who would never lift the latch. The house stayed quieter, his place at the meal stayed empty, and the sea. The sea offered no closure. One widow, it said, came to the shore every day at sunrise, looking out toward the horizon. She never wept, only stood still with her arms folded. She brought a small jar of honey and barley each morning, placed it on a flat rock by the water's edge, then turned and left without a word. She did this for a year. No one asked her to stop. No one called her mad. Everyone knew what she waited for, even if they didn't say it out loud. Men who survived sometimes avoided the families of the dead. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know what to say. One word, one wrong glance could reopen wounds. Others made it their duty to speak. They would sit quietly in a neighbor's home, hands folded, eyes lowered, and recall the final days of the lost one. He was brave. He didn't complain. He said he missed your stew. These details were precious. They became stories that were told again and again, reshaped slightly with each retelling until they became part of the family's memory. In some neighborhoods near the Piraeus, the presence of these stories was visible. Shrines lined the streets. Painted stones, oil lamps blackened by years of flame, wreaths made of dried olive leaves. Athens was a city that remembered its heroes with statues, but remembered its oarsmen in whispers. The priests debated what to do with those who died unburied. Some argued that a public ceremony should be held once a year, a ritual cleansing, a mass prayer. But the idea never fully caught on. Too many names, too few details, and the city moved quickly. War after war, voyage after voyage. The sea claimed more men than any battlefield, but there were no monuments for the drowned. Just the understanding that if you rowed, you might disappear, and if you returned, you kept rowing. There was no other choice. One philosopher of the time wrote, "To live in service of the state is noble, but to vanish in its name is not the same as being remembered by it." His words were not popular. Still, some tried to record the dead. A few scribes kept unofficial scrolls listing names mentioned by returning crew. These were passed among families like sacred texts. A name alone was not much, but it was something, proof that someone existed, if only in ink. Years later, a man who had rowed as a teenager returned to the same dock he had left from. He was older now, slower. He walked with a limp. He carried a folded scrap of parchment with 5 names written in charcoal. His friends, all gone. He read the list aloud once, standing near the water, then dropped the paper into the sea. It floated for a moment, then it sank. That was his ceremony. Quiet, private, complete. Even in silence, memory finds its place. Athens never built a great wall for the nameless sailors. There were no plaques along the harbor. But they lived on in the small things, in the way a widow placed bread near her window, in the way a child asked about the man in the faded drawing, in the way a ship commander paused when passing a certain rock where a man had once gone overboard. The city could not mourn them all. But it mourned in pieces, and the sea, with its endless surface and shifting moods, held each of those stories deep beneath the waves, where no one could disturb them, but where they never fully disappeared. Chapter 14. The quiet end of a veteran rower. There's a man who walked the docks each morning, long before the fishmongers finished arranging their catch. Before the market stalls unfurled their cloth canopies, before the shouting began, he carried a small woven basket. His left leg dragged slightly. His shoulders were rounded. A faded strip of blue cloth tied his worn tunic at the waist, and his face was leathered by wind and years. He had sat in the 3rd tier of the trireme, pulling oars through endless water. Lungs burning, hands blistered, muscles coiled with each stroke. He had survived battles that splintered other ships, storms that swallowed smaller crews, and commanders who never made it home. But now his fingers trembled when he reached for an apple. We kept time with the drum, though some of it came from screaming. His voice cracked when he tried to sing the songs they once chanted to keep rhythm. His mother would tug him away quickly, murmuring about madmen and the need to move on. He wasn't telling the stories to be heard. He told them to remember that they were real, that he had once mattered. He used to clean fish for a few copper coins, but his hands had grown too shaky. Now he sat because it gave him something to do. The stall owners tolerated him. Some knew he had once rowed. One even brought him a fig loaf every 6th day. No words, just a quiet gesture, respect and silence. But of rowing, always rowing, the same stroke, the same breath, the same pull. In the dream, he was young again, his back straight, his grip firm, the drum beat loud and steady. He never saw the faces of the men beside him, only the motion, only the rhythm. He no longer remembered all the names, just fragments, faces half-formed in memory, laughter heard only in dreams. He was known only as Lysandros now. Some said that wasn't even his real name, but Names mattered little at his age. There was no statue of him by the harbor gate. He had fought in battles that decided empires, but he had never touched a general's sword. He would just smile, slow and crooked. His victories were buried in his bones, worn down like the solace of his sandals. To the boys who chased stray dogs through puddles, he was just the old man who smells like salt. He ran his fingers over the grooves as if they were the lines of a friend's face. But he wasn't bitter. Not really. He understood that Athens was always hungry, always reaching for the next ship, the next battle, the next glory. His story didn't fit in the new songs, and that was all right. It wasn't much, just a cot, a pitcher of water, a window that didn't shut all the way. On the wall above the cot hung a single item, a small wooden piece from his ship, where we leave Lysandros in his final days and gently close the script with a soft reflection on memory time and the echo of forgotten lives carried on the tide. A wedge from the bench where he'd once sat. Burned into the wood was a faint pattern, the grain still marked by sweat and salt. To the younger sailors loading crates of olives, he was invisible. But to the few men who had rowed the longships of Athens during her proudest wars, he was something more. A relic? A reminder? A living echo? Lysandros had once been strong. Thick-armed, loud, and certain. Each morning, he walked to the same dock where his trireme had once returned, where his feet first touched dry land after months at sea. The timbers had changed, the ropes were new, but the smell of brine and oil was the same. He would stand at the edge for a while, basket forgotten at his side, staring out past the fishing boats and merchant ships, his eyes narrowed against the sun. Sometimes he spoke. Not to anyone, just out loud. They made me row through blood once, didn't even flinch. No one listened. Sometimes a child would stop and stare, clutching a fig roll, eyes wide. Lysandros didn't mind. In the afternoons, he sat on the flat stone near the fish stalls, sharpening an old knife he didn't use anymore. At night, Lysandros returned to a room not far from the harbor. He didn't pray anymore, not to Athena, not to Poseidon. But sometimes he held that wooden wedge in his hands before sleeping. The dreams came often now, not dreams of glory or victory or even Athens itself. He would wake with tears in his eyes and not know why. No one in the city asked for his stories. No bard came to write them down. But sometimes late in the day, an apprentice sailor or a curious girl would pause long enough to hear a phrase. They made us drink rainwater and call it wine. Or, we patched the hull with our cloaks once because there was nothing else. And occasionally someone would ask, is that true? Lysandros never answered with certainty. Some of it is. Some of it isn't. But we all came back rowing. Then he would laugh, raspy and warm, like driftwood rubbed smooth by time. In a city that moved forward, he had become something left behind. He had lived. He had rowed. He had come home. Not many could say that. And in the quiet moments when the sun dipped low and the sea turned gold, he felt something like peace. He would lean back on his bench, close his eyes, and let the rhythm return steady, slow, eternal. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 14, Segment 2, the final stretch of the story. Lysandros began to walk more slowly in his final year, not because of any sudden injury or illness, but because his body, after so many decades of movement, simply began to ease into stillness. The morning walks to the harbor grew shorter. The bench near the fishmongers became his resting place for longer stretches. He no longer rose before the sun. The words had all been said. The stories had been told. Not recorded, not carved in stone, but told enough times to become their own, their truth. He no longer needed to explain what it felt like to row until your hands cracked open, or to watch the horizon for smoke signaling another war. He had become his own memory. And memories, he knew, fade slowly but surely. Hands folded across his chest. The wedge of ship's wood rested just above his heart. The oil lamp had burned out during the night, leaving only the faintest trace of smoke in the air. They did not bury him. They gave him to the sea. One man muttered a few lines of an old rowing chant off-key, half forgotten, and they let the plank slide from their fingers into the water. It floated a moment, then began to drift. He slept later, waking to the softer sounds of the city, just beginning to stir carts rolling down stone alleys. Gulls crying above the tiled roofs, distant murmurs from the agora carried by the breeze. A few men gathered. They carried his body on a small plank of pine, wrapped in his old cloak, down to the very dock where he had once disembarked as a younger man. A pebble from the beach. These were not offerings in the religious sense. They were acknowledgments, marks that someone had lived and mattered, even if only for a while. The same boys who once taunted him now carried baskets of salted anchovies and bronze scales for their fathers. One of them, not quite tall enough to see over the fish stall, brought him water in a clay cup each morning without being asked. Lysandros would nod, give a gruff thank you, and the boy would hurry off without waiting for more. He would hold it without looking, his thumb tracing the grain until his breathing slowed, and quiet names carved into forgotten corners of the world. He often drifted to sleep this way, without fanfare or finality. In those dreams, the ship was always waiting. But by midday, a stall keeper who had known him longer than most walked the short distance to his room. But in a small corner of the harbor, a name stayed carved in wood, resisting the wear of salt and time. He didn't know why. He just did. And beside it, someone etched the faint outline of an oar, as if to say, he rowed. He knocked gently, then pushed the door open. Not broken, not abandoned, but whole, its hull painted bright, its oars ready, its sails snapping gently in the wind. They laughed it off, of course, blamed it on the wind or tired ears. But a few believed that somewhere, in a place beyond memory, the Trireme still sailed, still cut through the Aegean, still moved with the breath and sweat of men like Lysandros. He spoke less often, not from forgetfulness, but from quiet. At night, in the flickering glow of his oil lamp, Lysandros would sometimes reach for the piece of his old trireme. One morning, he did not appear at the harbor. No one panicked. The city was busy, loud. People assumed he was late, or perhaps unwell. There, under a thin blanket, Lysandros lay still, eyes closed. There was no family to call, no official burial planned. But word traveled among the sailors of Piraeus, passed quietly like a piece of folded parchment. They did not burn him. A simple act. 2 men stepped forward. The waves lapped against the stone. No speeches, no priest. The sea took him gently. And just like that, he was gone. But he wasn't truly forgotten. In the weeks that followed, a few older sailors carved his name, just Lysandros, into a beam near the dock. The letters were uneven, not official, but clear. Others began to leave small things nearby. A chipped cup, a strip of blue cloth. The boy who had brought him water kept doing so, pouring it gently onto the dock plank each morning where Lysandros used to sit. And in this quiet way, the rhythm continued. The city moved forward, as cities always do. Ships came and went. Oars stirred again in distant corners. The assembly bickered. The markets bustled. Some nights, when the breeze came in low and strong from the sea, fishermen swore they heard the faint beat of a rowing drum echoing across the waves. And maybe they were right. Because history doesn't only live in scrolls and statues. It lives in rhythm, and footsteps repeated, and stories retold. Lysandros had no monument. But every oar dipped into water since his time echoed his motion. And that perhaps is how we remember the ones who never asked to be remembered, but simply endured. As the waves quiet and the oars finally come to rest, we leave behind the ship, the sea, and the stories carved into time. The men who rode into history without names on monuments or songs in the streets live on in quiet echoes. Their rhythm fades gently now, like the tide against the stones. Thank you for drifting through the past with us. If your eyes are still open, feel free to leave a kind word in the comments, or simply rest knowing you've journeyed far tonight. You've been watching The Drowsy Historian, where the past whispers and sleep comes easy. Until next time, may your dreams be still and your history quietly remembered. Good night.